This is what greatness looks like. Not very good, not best manager of a season, not best manager a league has had, and not best manager for a period of time. This is sport-defining greatness. And here's what separates Pep Guardiola from every other managerial great. This isn't the story of one revolutionary system that changed football. It's the story of constant metamorphosis, of a manager who has fundamentally tweaked and at times reinvented his approach, not once, not twice, but continuously across nearly 2 decades at the summit of the sport. So how did a defensive midfielder from Sampdoria evolve from Barcelona B's novice coach into football's most influential tactician? The answer begins not with his management career, but in a deliberate, almost obsessive preparation that started years before he even stood in a technical area. When Pep Guardiola announced his retirement in 2006, most saw it as the end of a distinguished playing career. What they didn't see was the beginning of something far more calculated. For years, Guardiola had been Johan Cruyff's on-field conductor, the metronome at the heart of Barcelona's dream team. And it's safe to say in every interaction Pep had with the Dutchman, he was looking far beyond the surface. Every positional adjustment, every tactical tweak, and every philosophical discussion with the Dutch master was being filed away, analyzed, and kept in the mind of a future tactical master. But here's where things get really interesting. What do you see here? Yes, that's Pep reacting, but who's the guy next to him? That's Juanma Lillo. See, Pep's final playing season wasn't some sentimental farewell tour, and yes, the move to Mexico had seemed rather random, but Pep had done it for educational purposes. He specifically sought out Lillo, turning his final playing year into an intense tactical apprenticeship 8,000 miles from home. And by the time Pep actually retired, he had an interesting mix of ideas formulating in his mind. The principles of Barcelona DNA, Cruyff, learnings from Lillo, all viewed through his unique lens of football. But he needed a testing ground to trial these ideas. And his former side Barcelona came calling, and that lab was going to be Barcelona B. Here he took over a side that was spiraling and headed into darkness, having just suffered relegation to the Tercera League for the first time since 1974. But even more importantly, in this testing ground, he was already beginning to see that his ideals were not just a fairy tale. They had the potential to succeed at the very highest level. And even at this lower level of football, he implemented a style that would become the level that managers aspired to. And in the process, he got Barcelona B immediately promoted to the Segunda division. And what was that style and tactical approach? Well, it will soon become obvious. Revolutionaries are considered insane until their ideas work. In the summer of 2008, Pep Guardiola was already walking that knife edge between genius and madness. His first moves as Barcelona's senior manager were beyond bold. In fact, they bordered on sacrilege. Consider this. You're a young novice manager, promoted from the B team with 0 top-flight experience. Your predecessor is Frank Rijkaard, a Champions League winner. Your squad contains a Ballon d'Or winner of just 2 years prior, and he is still considered the most entertaining footballer on the planet. So what do? If you're Pep Guardiola, you show him the door. Ronaldinho, the magician who had resurrected Barcelona and who had made the Camp Nou cheer every weekend, was unceremoniously shipped to AC Milan. Yes, injuries had taken their toll. Yes, his form had dipped, but this was still Ronaldinho. You don't discard genius just because it's going through a bad spell. Unless you're Pep Guardiola and you have a clear vision for the future. The Brazilian wasn't alone in being exiled. Deco, another architect of Barcelona's 2006 Champions League triumph, found himself shipped off to Chelsea. Thuram retired, Edmilson released, Dos Santos sold. One by one, the team was being dismantled, each departure raising the stakes of Guardiola's gamble. Now imagine the narrative if he had failed. A former player getting one of the most prestigious jobs on earth based on his connections, drunk on his own tactical theories, and had gone on to destroy a European giant through his own hubris and inexperience. The press were already sharpening their knives. The pressure was immense. Guardiola had dismantled this great Barcelona side. If his approach failed, he'd be the man who sent the club into the dark ages for his own ego. But Barcelona's board, in an act of either supreme faith or spectacular recklessness, backed their revolutionary. Nearly 100 million euros went into the transfer market, and this was serious money back in 2008. Dani Alves became the world's most expensive fullback at almost 36 million euros, a fee that raised eyebrows across Europe. And it was the context that made Guardiola's revolution even more audacious. Looking at the squad, it wasn't a club crying out for radical surgery. On paper, Rijkaard's final team had been loaded with talent. But when not looking at paper, there was a troubling reality. Barcelona Barcelona had not won La Liga for 2 consecutive seasons, and in fact, they'd finished 18 points behind Real Madrid in the last one. 18. A chasm was beginning to emerge between them and their rivals. And very soon, Guardiola had established his first choice 11. The names were impressive, but what unfolded on the pitch would redefine football itself. And the revolution began improbably with the goal kick. In 2008, football's approach to goal kicks was carved into stone. Identify your best aerial threat, cluster bodies around him, launch the long ball, and fight for the second ball. Every team from Barcelona to Stoke followed this gospel. It was simple, proven, and unquestionable. But Guardiola looked at this accepted wisdom and saw madness. His logic was simple. When Victor Valdés had the ball in his hand, Barcelona had 100% possession. The moment it was in the air, well, at best it was a 50-50. And for a team that, in Guardiola's own words, was awful without the ball, taking this gamble of gifting the opposition the ball was unacceptable. But the solution wasn't to get better at winning aerial duels, it was to eliminate them entirely. So Barcelona's centre-backs began dropping towards their own penalty area during goal kicks, offering shorter options. Initially, opponents were bemused. Defenders receiving so close to their own goal? It seemed like a gift. One wrong move and they would immediately be through on goal. But as teams began pressing this short distribution, Guardiola's trap became clear. The centre-backs would drop even deeper, sometimes level with the 6-yard box. Touré would sink between them, and Guardiola was posing a question to every opponent. How badly do you really want this ball? To those who answered very badly, well, they had already lost. The maths was devastating. La Liga in 2008 was dominated by the 4-4-2 and the 4-2-3-1. Against the 4-4-2, once play resumed and Valdés became an active participant, well, suddenly it was a 3 versus 2 in the midfield. And if an extra midfielder pushed up to compensate, the remaining midfielder faced an impossible overload. And the 4-2-3-1 fared little better. Teams learned painfully and publicly that pressing Barcelona's goal kicks was futile, which meant that Barcelona's centre-backs were now seeing more of the ball than any defenders in Spanish football, exactly as planned. But now in open play, could opponents have more luck pressuring here? Well, it turns out during his time in Mexico, it wasn't just Juanma Lillo he was learning from. Ricardo Lavolpe, the World Cup winning goalkeeper with Argentina, had become a mainstay as a manager in Liga MX, and although he was now head of the Mexican national team, during Guardiola's playing stint, he still had a lot of tactical influence on the Mexican league. And what was that influence? Well, one of them was that every attack had to begin from the back, with the defense moving up as a unit with the ball. Sound familiar? And if that wasn't on the nose enough, back in 2006, writing for Spanish newspaper El País, Guardiola noted, Lavolpe demands that his teams play out from the back, which means that players and the ball advance together at the same time. If only one player does this, there is no reward, no value. They have to do it together, like couples do when they go out together. But the important part wasn't just how they played out from the back, it was the exact way that they did it. See, Ricardo Lavolpe was often up against 4-4-2s at the time. So in open play, with the goalkeeper no longer a factor, the potential for pressure was there, but he was committed to playing out. So the centerpiece of his philosophy was La Salida Lavolpiana, the Lavolpe exit. When pressed, the pivot would drop between the centre-backs, creating a temporary back three. Today, even every Sunday league team attempts this. In 2008, well, it was the start of a tactical revolution. When Yaya Touré executed this drop, the cascading effects were devastating. Piqué, already exceptional in possession, now had additional passing angles. Puyol, less comfortable on the ball, had pressure relieved. And most critically, this three-man foundation liberated the Barcelona fullbacks. Abidal was naturally a little more conservative, becoming a wide passing option, but Dani Alves on the other hand, the world record fee suddenly made perfect sense. With the security of the back three behind him, Alves transformed into an auxiliary winger, creating numerical superiority wherever he appeared. The beauty of Guardiola's system was now showing itself week by week. See, generally when the ball was deep, Pep wanted his wingers to hug the touchline and get chalk on their boots. The purpose was to either force the defense to stretch out wide, creating room for the likes of Xavi and Iniesta to exploit, which was a deadly situation for any team. But now, if they stayed compact, they had granted a little extra room for the 1 versus 1 for the winger. Down the left, Henry was less of a silky dribbler, so how his isolations were used was taking advantage of his pace, playing him into the room on the inside of the fullback. Down the right, well, a young Messi was already becoming the complete forward, with the option of using his pace like Henry on the other side. But when isolated against a fullback, he could receive the ball to feet, and his dribbling was already potentially the best in the world, and he could blow past his man either on the inside or the outside, to then very quickly move the team into dangerous positions high up the pitch. There was another key factor though that stopped the aggressive pressing. What trait did these three have in common? Yes, all three are greats of the game, but there's a much simpler factor as well. All three had great movement and were incredibly quick. And here's the thing, for an effective high press, the opposition would have needed a high line. And something tells me that one of Yaya, Xavi, or Iniesta would have the weight of pass to find a runner behind the high line. The entire setup was designed to discourage the high press, and it worked. Teams would fall deeper and deeper, which just made it easier and easier for Barcelona to dominate the ball and get their technical players on it with time and space, which is exactly where Guardiola wanted them. As opponents retreated, Barcelona's midfield shapeshifted again. The pivot rejoined the midfield, creating new overloads. Against 4-2-3-1 formations, Xavi became an auxiliary deep-lying playmaker against the attacking midfielder, while Iniesta pushed higher, supported by Henry's width, pinning the right back, while the centre-back was hesitant to push up, as that would leave a gap that both Henry and Eto'o were itching to take advantage of. Add to that Abidal being positioned to slide passes into him, and Barcelona were looking dangerous. And yes, in the 4-2-3-1, the remaining midfielder could move across, but this was the other wrinkle in the tactical system. If early in the build, Messi's job was to force the defense to be less compact through the middle, higher up he would move into this inside channel, helping the central overload and making that decision to cover Iniesta early a much less viable one. There was no solution. Many La Liga sides effectively gave up possession of the ball, and they sat in, trying to fend off the attack, hoping to hit Barcelona on the counter-attack. And Barcelona, patient as ever, would rotate the ball, and if that failed, they rotated players, and if that failed, it all happened at once, luring their opponents into a daze and waiting for that one time the defender made the wrong choice and striking straight at the heart. So what of these opposition counterattacks that we talked about? Well, to wage an effective counterattack, you need players positioned high up the pitch to play directly into and then allow the rest of the team to join. But the problem with sitting so deep and essentially drawing every single player back to defend is that they had essentially sacrificed the quick counterattack. So what was the solution? When they won the ball, teams had to try and initially play the ball in their own third to give their forwards the time to push up the pitch and then eventually launch an attack of their own. So what was the problem? Well, Pep's slow positional build-up meant that most of the players were high up the pitch when they lost the ball, and those close distances they kept between each other to keep possession meant that they had numbers directly around the ball if they lost it. And so Pep introduced the 6-second rule, counterpressing taken to the extreme. As soon as Barcelona lost the ball, they had 6 seconds to swarm around it and try to win it back through intense, unrelenting pressure. When the 6-second press failed, and it rarely did, Barcelona would drop into a 4-1-4-1, compact and organized and ready to begin their elaborate possession sequences again. One season in, and Guardiola's machine was more than functional. It was purring with precision. And just like that, there was a 25-point swing against Madrid. Champions League victory against one of Fergie's finest sides, all topped off by the fact that it was a debut treble. But already, Guardiola's mind was racing ahead, identifying evolutions that would push his creation beyond excellence. The first season was successful, but change was already in motion. Laporta's presidency would end in 2010, and his likely successor, Sandro Rosell, represented a different faction of Barcelona politics, one less aligned with the Cruyffian philosophy that Guardiola embodied. And across Europe, a key man, inextricably linked to the Guardiola era, watched Barcelona's treble with cold interest. His Inter side was building towards something special of their own, and the two would meet again soon enough. How do you improve on near perfection? It's a question that would haunt most managers, but for Pep, standing on top of European football with a treble in his cabinet, it was merely the next problem to solve. The success of his first campaign had created its own prison. La Liga opponents, having witnessed Barcelona's systemic destruction of traditional defensive structures, had adopted a new approach: damage limitation. Matches at the Camp Nou increasingly looked like training sessions, with visiting teams deploying 9, sometimes 10 players behind the ball, happy to lose 1-0 rather than 5-0. Barcelona's mesmeric passing patterns could usually unlock these blocks eventually, but usually wasn't good enough for Pep. He was already identifying inefficiencies that might have been ignored by everybody else. His first evolution came in the midfield. Yaya Toure had been stellar in Guardiola's first season, but increasingly his understudy was taking priority. Sergio Busquets, another blank canvas from Barcelona B, offered something different. Touré had been incredible, but Busquets offered absolute positional discipline and an almost supernatural ability to read the game and evade the press. Touré was just another star, slowly being shown the exit by Pep. But the real change would come up front. Pep had identified a tactical dilemma. If every team was dropping deep and effectively eliminating the space behind their defense, what use was a centre forward whose primary weapon was running in behind? Samuel Eto'o, for all his brilliance, was built for a different kind of football. His link-up play wasn't a weakness exactly, but it wasn't the strength Guardiola now needed. Because what if just maybe, instead of avoiding the long ball entirely, they used it as an emergency exit and turned those 50-50 long balls, maybe 70-30 in their favour. And an aerial target that good could also be a good plan B against a deeper block if Barcelona were forced to swing in crosses from out wide against deeper defences. The manager's solution was bold and ruthless. Eto'o, the loyal servant and elite striker, beloved by the Camp Nou, was packed off to Inter Milan. In return came the one forward who seemed to tick every box in Guardiola's evolving blueprint, Zlatan Ibrahimovic. On paper, it was genius. He was 6'5" and he was the perfect aerial outlet. But at the same time, his technical ability meant he could drop deep and link the play, the Barcelona way. What could go wrong? Well, everything as it turned out. Tactically, Guardiola wasn't revolutionizing his system. Instead, it was more about refinement, taking that near perfection to perfection. And at this level, a tiny improvement would mean the difference between being the heavy favourites and being essentially unbeatable. The positional play in the build-up remained, though with even less fluidity. Players were expected to maintain strict positions, rotating only in predefined patterns. Busquets had long mastered La Salida Lavolpiana, and that combined with his ball manipulation made him the perfect Pep pivot to such a degree that pressing him became fully useless. Another deterrent for teams who were even contemplating pressing Barcelona high. But up front, we saw the biggest changes, and the first issues appeared almost immediately. With teams refusing to press, the emergency outlet ball into Zlatan's chest wasn't as important as anticipated. But there was a deeper issue, one that would define Barcelona's season and ultimately Messi's career. In Pep's first season, Messi had operated as a relatively traditional right winger, only cutting in the final third, or when Barcelona desperately needed central overloads in the final third against a deep block. But the Argentine was ascending to his throne. Even in this array of stars, he was becoming the point around which everything rotated. Logic dictated that he should see as much of the ball as possible. So Messi began drifting inside earlier and earlier, gravitating towards these spaces, either centrally or just off the right. His primary movement was no longer forward from the wing, but instead it was now inwards towards his teammates. But this did have its downsides. Remember how just in the season prior they had three forwards who loved to run in behind? Well, if Messi was now moving in, there was a lot less of that happening down the right-hand side. In isolation, central Messi was a massive tactical upgrade. The Argentine could weave magic between the lines, and his positioning could be strategically important. With teams no longer pressing the backline, Barcelona's midfield had lost their numerical advantage, especially against a 4-2-3-1. Messi moving inside recreated that advantage, especially down the right, where it gave Xavi license to drop deeper and assist Busquets, while at the same time amplifying Dani Alves, who now spent more time as a right winger than anything resembling a traditional fullback. The problem? Zlatan had identical instincts. The Swede could hold up the ball expertly. That's why Pep had bought him. But Ibrahimovic wasn't content being a target man, and he certainly wasn't going to be stretching defenses like Eto'o had before him. He wanted touches, combinations, involvement. He needed to drop into those same spaces that Messi was increasingly claiming as his own. Two geniuses, one zone, and neither particularly interested in sharing. Guardiola's tactical philosophy demanded structure above all else. Two players operating in the same channel wasn't just against his philosophy. It made defending easier, more predictable. And that was the very thing that the system was designed to prevent. But there was another issue. At the tail end of the previous season, in a Clásico that would echo throughout history, Pep had experimented with something radical. He moved Eto'o wide right and deployed Messi as a false nine. And Messi had taken to the new position. And now, Zlatan or no Zlatan, Messi wanted to play in this position that he now saw as his own. The Swedish striker's problems went beyond just jealousy. The knock-on effects on the defense were huge. Barcelona's pressing demanded 11 players operating in perfect synchronization. One slow presser or one player unwilling to sprint back and the entire system collapsed. Zlatan, unlike Eto'o, was neither built for or interested in pressing. This made Pep's choice even easier. He had an unhappy superstar who couldn't press, and on the other hand, a generational talent whose evolution was being stifled. The decision came after what Zlatan would later describe as a breaking point, screaming at Pep in the dressing room and accusing him of not having the balls to handle big personalities. The Swedish striker even claimed Guardiola was scared of Mourinho. Whether exaggerated or not, the relationship between the pair was irreparably damaged. Zlatan soon discovered what the Barcelona bench looked like, a view he'd rarely seen in his career. Of the 38 La Liga matches, he and Messi only shared the pitch 26 times, and of those, they only played at least an hour together 14 times. So who was his replacement? Another protege from the B team. Pedro, filled with nervous energy and tactical discipline, understood something that Zlatan would never. At Barcelona, the system was the star. With Pedro holding the right wing, Messi had the freedom to operate as the false nine. The graduate's La Masia education meant that he understood positional play instinctively. When Messi stayed high, Pedro hugged the touchline, often supported by Alves. But when Messi dropped deep, which was increasingly often, Pedro's movement was surgical. He waited until the exact moment a centre-back was drawn towards Messi before arriving with a perfectly timed third-man run, often finding himself 1v1 with the keeper. The left wing presented different challenges. Iniesta's injury problems meant that he started just 20 of the 38 league games, and it created a tactical issue. Barcelona missed his quality, sure, but Iniesta also possessed a gravitational pull that drew defenders, creating space for Henry. Without Iniesta, the capable but comparatively limited Keita was filling in, allowing defenders to focus entirely on the French winger. Time was catching up to Henry too. That explosive acceleration was slowly fading, the margins that separated elite from excellent evaporating. 4 goals in 21 matches, his worst rate since 1999, told the full story. Pep, unsentimental as ever, restricted Henry to just 21 starts, often playing Pedro on the left when Zlatan still featured. But when Iniesta was available and Messi had claimed his central throne, Guardiola showed another evolution. Control was becoming an obsession, and Iniesta, rather than always be in the center, actually operated as a nominal left winger, and he served this goal of control perfectly. Against deep blocks, there was no space to run into anyway, and the prime example of this was when Barca faced off against Inter Milan. And over the 2 legs, the Italians put on a masterclass in counter-attacking football, giving La Blaugrana no space to run in behind. And it was a perfect example why having an extra creator drifting in from the wide areas might be more important than a runner in behind. Iniesta drifting inside created an even more overwhelming midfield superiority. So the width, well, that had to come from the new starting left-back, Maxwell, who was much more adventurous than Abidal, pushing high up on the touchline. It was ultimate control, all the midfielders plus Messi in close proximity, moving the ball to move the opposition, waiting for that one bad decision to strike. Barcelona also signed Denis Chigrinsky. The tactics evolved, the control had intensified, and despite the Zlatan situation, the silverware kept flowing. But Guardiola wasn't satisfied. He never was. The deep blocks were getting even deeper, and somewhere in his mind the next evolution was already taking shape. But there were factors beyond the pitch that would influence Guardiola's tenure. He didn't know it yet, but he had had an encounter this season that would echo throughout his career and his tactical evolution. The Champions League semi-final at the Camp Nou. Inter Milan under Mourinho had come to destroy rather than play. They had gotten ahead, and Inter held on, then eliminated Barcelona in the second leg. Mourinho's sprint across the Camp Nou pitch, arms raised in celebration, was a declaration of war. Their once cordial relationship was dead. The villain in the Guardiola story had been identified. June brought changes in La Liga. Mourinho signed for Real Madrid with one explicit mission: destroy Guardiola's Barcelona. Meanwhile, in Barcelona's own boardroom, Sandro Rosell had won the presidency. His first act? Stripping Johan Cruyff of his honorary presidency, a deliberate severing of the lineage that connected Cruyff to Guardiola. The decision led to animosity between Cruyff and Rosell, with Pep's idol refusing to set foot in the Camp Nou whilst Rosell was president. If seasons 1 and 2 had been about constructing and refining the philosophy, season 3 was something else entirely: the pursuit of perfection, and perhaps its achievement. This was the pinnacle of Pep Guardiola's Barcelona. Not just the best team in the world, but possibly the best team there has ever been. The evolution between seasons was almost imperceptible this time. No wholesale tactical revolution, no dramatic personnel overhaul. Instead, it was just the finest of adjustments. The Zlatan experiment was history. Messi now reigned as the undisputed false nine. No more power struggles polluting the dressing room, and no spells shunted to the wing. The system revolved around him, and everyone understood their part to play. Pedro was now a permanent fixture rather than a plan B, and he had claimed the right wing as his own. The previous season's stopgap solution of having Iniesta wide often had served its purpose, papering over Henry's decline. But Iniesta was wasted anywhere except his natural habitat, the left-sided interior channel, where he could orchestrate and devastate in equal measure. With Seydou Keita returning to the bench, Pep now needed a solution for the vacant left wing. Enter David Villa. He was a forward who understood sacrifice without considering its sacrifice. Villa's natural instinct was to play as a traditional 9. He'd built his reputation there, scoring goals aplenty in La Liga for years. But at Barcelona, he knew that his individual preference would be secondary to collective harmony. Rather than just accept playing on the wing, Villa embraced it. The transformation was immediate and devastating. The previous season's problem, the 3 forwards who preferred coming short rather than stretching the defense, disappeared overnight. Villa and Pedro were runners, pure and simple. Every time an opponent's defensive line crept even a yard too high, they were gone, heels disappearing towards the goal. But here's what made this Barcelona truly special. They didn't need high lines to exploit. When you combine forwards with elite movement, with this kind of timing, with passes like Xavi, Iniesta and Messi, even the deepest defensive line became vulnerable. One swing of Xavi's boot could thread a through ball through a gap that didn't exist the moment it was played. A Messi through ball could find impossible angles. And Messi himself was even more unpredictable now. Yes, he still dropped deep more often, dragging centre-backs into impossible decisions. But at any moment without warning, he could explode into the space created. Defenders who followed him deep suddenly found themselves 5 yards behind as he spun and accelerated. But those who held their position watched helplessly as he orchestrated the play from the midfield. The forward line was also now incredibly flexible. Unlike the Ibrahimovic era's positional conflicts, these 3 forwards existed in perfect harmony. Pedro could start right or left and excel in either. Villa was equally comfortable wide or through the middle, constantly making diagonal runs. Messi could begin anywhere across the front line and end up everywhere. Opposition managers would later describe the sensation of facing this Barcelona as drowning in slow motion. They could see what was happening, they could understand the danger, but they remained powerless to stop it. Every adjustment created a problem. Should you mark Messi tightly? Well, now Xavi and Iniesta would dissect you. Maybe you should sit in a deep block. Well, then they'll pass around you for 90 minutes, waiting for one moment of imbalance. Okay, so maybe do the unpredictable and press high. And what do you see? Villa and Pedro would be celebrating before you turned around. On the pitch, things were beautiful, but off the pitch, Pep was increasingly growing tired of having to act as spokesman for the entire club and having to deal with off-the-pitch issues with no protection from Sandro Rosell. In 2011, Pep was having to deal with more and more insidious accusations. Spanish radio station Cadena COPE, citing Real Madrid sources, broadcast allegations that Barcelona's players were doping. Pep was disgusted. The football war was becoming something much uglier. Pep had always seen the touchline as a sanctuary. When the game was on, the football was the focus, not the media and not the politics. But in April 2011, one man successfully brought the off-the-pitch ugliness to Pep Guardiola's sacred space. 4 Clásicos in 18 days. Mourinho would spend almost a month waging psychological war on Guardiola, and the tension built. On the eve of the Champions League semi-final first leg, Pep finally snapped. In an extraordinary press conference, he unleashed years of frustration at Mourinho.
Jugar al fútbol lo mejor posible. En esta sala, él es el puto jefe, el puto amo, es el que más sabe del mundo. Yo no quiero ni competir ni un instante.
After Barcelona won the first leg 2-0, Mourinho's response was venomous. He claimed Guardiola should be ashamed of Barcelona's 2009 Champions League, calling it the scandal of Stamford Bridge. The accusation that Guardiola's success was built on refereeing favours cut deep. When the dust settled after the second leg, an exhausted Guardiola admitted, "These have been 18 impossible days. I have no good memories of this." Barcelona came out on top, but more energy was drained from the Guardiola tank. Still, the stats from this season border on surreal. The trophies accumulated: La Liga, the Champions League, Copa del Rey, UEFA Super Cup, FIFA Club World Cup. But it was the manner of the victory that stunned. The 5-0 demolition of Real Madrid at the Camp Nou was Pep's tactical magnum opus with this side. The Champions League final against Manchester United demoralized Sir Alex Ferguson, as he openly admitted that his team had been made to look less than ordinary.
That's what I watched the final against Barcelona at Wembley. I should have changed at half-time and put Jesus and Park and Messi. That was a mistake. I realised after 10 minutes, I was going to do it at half-time, and they'll say, well, we'll just equalise before half-time. They may see the game differently, and we may grow into the game better.
But there was a telling detail in the summer celebrations. When offered a new contract, Pep would only sign for 1 more year. Not 2, not 3, just 1. Those close to him noticed he was thinner. The constant battle with Mourinho and the Spanish media were taking their toll. In November, another blow. His trusted assistant, Tito Vilanova, was diagnosed with a tumour. Football suddenly felt very small. But Pep still soldiered on, at the summit of world football. Having assembled possibly the greatest club side in history, Pep looked at his creation and decided it needed to change. Again. In Pep's restless mind, standing still was moving backwards. Even perfection apparently could be improved. Or maybe perfection was the problem. How could one man maintain these standards for so long while fighting a war on multiple fronts? Tactical war, political war, and a personal war. The answer would come sooner than we expected. The summer of 2011 brought modest change. Alexis Sanchez came in. But the headlines were stolen by Cesc Fabregas, who finally came home after Barcelona's protracted and somewhat underhanded pursuit. Ibrahimovic was gone, his Barcelona nightmare ending with the move to Milan. On paper, once again, evolution rather than revolution. Plan A as always remained the positional 4-3-3, but Pep quickly found out that reality doesn't always care about your plan A. The upcoming chaos of the season began with a warning sign. In August's Spanish Super Cup, a late Barcelona winner sparked a melee. In the chaos, Mourinho calmly walked up behind Tito Vilanova and poked him in the eye. The image, Mourinho's finger in Tito's eye, was captured on camera. Pep was outraged. Yet Mourinho faced no significant punishment. The message was clear. The war had no rules. Back on the pitch, Pep had other issues. The warning signs came early. Soft tissue injuries began accumulating. Puyol's body, after years of being put on the line, was beginning to rebel. Iniesta's muscles couldn't cope with the demands. Piqué broke down. Alexis Sanchez, still new to Barcelona's intensity, also often found himself in the medical department. And then came December. David Villa, chasing a harmless ball in the Club World Cup semi-final, shattered his tibia and his season was over. Eric Abidal was fighting a battle far beyond football, and he required a liver transplant, also ending his season. For the first time in Pep's tenure, Barcelona's first-choice 11 became completely unstable and unpredictable throughout. Pep had always declared that his team should rest when they were in possession, but out of possession, they should press like dogs. But 4 years of this philosophy, the constant pressing, the endless sprints to recover possession within 6 seconds, had exacted their toll. The players' bodies were struggling to keep up, and the machine was beginning to break down. Pep was also breaking down. Friends had noticed he had lost significant weight. The man whose eyes always looked like they were focused on 100 tactical ideas at any time were beginning to lose that luster. He'd started taking sleeping pills, unable to quiet his mind after matches. 4 years of gegenpressing had exhausted the players, but 4 years of constant war had exhausted Pep. But still, he carried on, and tactically, his response was to become even more Pep. If he couldn't field his best players in a system, he'd create an even more controllable system. He needed total control. The solution? Flood the midfield. The back three wasn't entirely new to Barcelona, but now it was a necessity instead of a variation. When fit, that back three was Puyol, Piqué, and Abidal. But in this season, first-choice players being fit had become a fantasy. The combinations grew increasingly random and varied. Mascherano, Abidal, Busquets 1 week, Piqué, Mascherano, Adriano the next. And on a couple of surreal occasions, even Dani Alves found himself manning the defense alongside Mascherano and Abidal. The logic made sense. 3 defenders almost guaranteed numerical superiority against opposition forwards, and that was paired with the threat of their central domination. Barca could essentially sleepwalk through their own third, and they comfortably spent the least time in their own third in the league. But against stronger opposition, it could be a different story. The 2-1 home defeat in April against their eternal rivals exposed every compromise. Mascherano, reinvented as a centre-back by necessity, was still learning the position's nuances. The Puyol, Mascherano, Busquets trio couldn't hold. Madrid's counterattacks carved through them throughout the 90. And this was just the secondary expense of having this back three. The real cost wasn't just having an unfamiliar back three. In the midfield, Xavi of course could dictate the game just as effectively as Busquets. The real sacrifice came on the defensive end. We don't think of Busquets as this tackle-heavy destroyer, because he is not, but he still has a defensive midfielder's instincts. He defends with his brain, spotting concerning situations before they arise. And well, compared to these 4, he may as well be Casemiro when it comes to defensive physicality. All of this would contribute to them having less defensive capability in the midfield, which fed into wanting more control. So in most matches, when possible, it was Seydou Keita at pivot. He was confident and capable, and certainly helped the leaky midfield. But in possession, he was no Busquets. So Busquets deep also meant that the metronomic midfield quality had diminished. And we saw a shift from Pep. For so long, the number 6 had been the spoke around which the team rotated. But now the control had to come from elsewhere. Higher up the pitch, Barcelona assembled perhaps the most technically gifted midfield in history. And when possible, Xavi, Iniesta, Thiago Alcantara, and Fabregas. 4 maestros who could make the ball sing. Opposition managers weren't stupid. They recognized the danger and responded predictably. Extreme defensive compression, narrow blocks so tight that even Barcelona's magicians struggled for space. Guardiola needed width to stretch these defensive walls, to create gaps for his technicians to exploit. The traditional solution, overlapping fullbacks, wasn't possible. Maxwell and Adriano were willing, but limited considering the fact they wouldn't just be supplementing the width, as they would have had there already been wingers out wide. But wide men now would be expected to be genuine threats. The new game Pep had been playing this season needed something more extreme, so Pep pushed his wingers to wing back. It was tactical innovation, but it did have a scent of desperation at times. The likes of Pedro, Christian Teo, Adriano, and on the especially adventurous occasions, Alexis Sanchez, who are all attackers by trade and instinct, found themselves starting from wing-back positions on paper. On paper, it was madness, but for the most part, it worked. The gamble relied on simple logic. Barcelona's possession dominance meant that their wing-backs would barely be defending anyway. They spent just 19% of matches in their own third, less than any team in Europe. So why waste defensive players in positions that rarely required defending? So now teams couldn't just afford to grant the Sanchez's, the Alves's, and the Pedro's complete room, and had to spread out at least a tiny bit. And that was all the room that Barcelona needed, as now they could pierce the heart. And in fact, no side attacked through the center of the pitch more often than Barcelona. The width had created central room. And this brings us to Cesc Fabregas, and the season's most fascinating tactical evolution. The prodigal son had returned after years of Barcelona's public pursuit, a pursuit that had damaged relationships between the two clubs. And now the pressure was immense. At Arsenal, he'd been the center. At Barcelona, he was just another piece, orbiting Messi. But rather than resist this reality, Fabregas embraced it with the intelligence that explained why Pep had pursued him so relentlessly. His role became beautifully simple: respond to Messi's movements. When Messi dropped deep, as he increasingly did, a normal team would have lost presence in the penalty area. But Fabregas, positioned at the tip of Pep's diamond, would surge into the vacated space. When Messi stayed high, Fabregas operated as a playmaker, finding space between the lines, much like he had at Arsenal. It was essentially at times a double false nine, 2 players alternating between being a creator and a finisher, so fluidly that defenders could not track who was who. The stats validated the partnership. Messi and Fabregas finished first and second for goal contributions in La Liga for Barcelona. Messi's numbers went from ridiculous to the stuff of legend: 50 league goals, his career high. 73 goals across competitions, yet this was undoubtedly Guardiola's worst Barcelona team. Some of this was for non-tactical reasons. The injuries were just too many, and it meant that it was a combination of Pep always having to change the shape depending on who was available, decreased quality when it was the second choice personnel, as well as players having ever-changing partners from week to week, making it harder to form those associative relationships. But there were other factors, because what is the difference between 11-12's goal-scoring charts for Barca and those from the season prior? Just look at how many goals the second and third top scorers had, and what positions they played. In 2010-11, Villa and Pedro had contributed 18 and 13 league goals, respectively, from wide. Now, the wingers, instead of attacking the goals, often had to hug the touchlines as wingbacks, rather than make diagonal runs, so their goal threat diminished. The team's attacking burden concentrated increasingly on one man. Barcelona threatened to become Messi FC, and while the Argentine accepted this responsibility well, weakness can't be hidden by individual brilliance forever. The defensive frailties were even more damning. Their goals conceded in open play nearly doubled from the previous season. The trophies still came: Copa del Rey, UEFA Super Cup, Supercopa de España, and Club World Cup. Because this was still Barcelona, still Messi, and still Pep. They had 91 points in La Liga, a total that would win the title in most seasons, but not this one. Mourinho's Madrid, playing percentage football with surgical counterattacks, claimed the throne with 100 points. And in Europe, they fell to Chelsea's defensive fortress. For the first time in 4 years, Barcelona ruled neither Spain nor Europe. And the strain showed everywhere. In press conferences, Pep looked haunted, and his eyes looked a bit duller. He'd become part-time manager, part-time spokesman, and part-time defender of Barcelona's political causes. The joy that defined his early seasons had turned into obligation. In April, after being knocked out of the Champions League, Pep looked at his players and felt something break. He later admitted he couldn't motivate the players anymore. They'd won everything together, and his voice no longer galvanized them. The exhausted coach recognized an exhausted team. 3 days after the Chelsea elimination, Pep met with President Rosell. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and Rosell urged him to reconsider, to delay any announcement, but Pep's mind was made up. "I'm empty," he told Rosell. "I have nothing left to give."
L'error és molt simple, són 4 anys, el temps ho desgasta tot i jo m'he desgastat. M'he buidat i necessito omplir-me.
Pep retreated to the shadows, a 1-year sabbatical, anonymous in New York and away from the football media, a time for mental rejuvenation. When he returned to football, he would be different, game would be different, and Barcelona would never be quite the same. And if you're a fan of Pep, you're a fan of tactics. So if you want to elevate your tactical knowledge, Tactical Mastery is perfect for you. Tactical Mastery is simply designed to be your one-stop resource to learn everything you need to know about tactical analysis from the ground up, as I've compressed a decade of learning analysis into a highly detailed but simply presented program that cuts no corners. The goal of the program is simple: transform you into a highly skilled and confident tactical analyst. But learning in theory is the first step, so I've negotiated with my software provider, Once Video Analyzer, so that you get access to it for free for 2 months, plus a discount if you decide to purchase. So you won't just be learning concepts in theory, you will have the ability to implement them. Not only that, if you join Ultra or Creator, you get access to a community of other analysts, some who are early in their journey, some with badges from various FAs or even UEFA, meaning that you will be able to learn from the community and push yourself forwards faster. So head over to footballmadesimple.co.uk to check out Tactical Mastery. There's a unique kind of pressure that comes with inheriting perfection. In the summer of 2013, Pep Guardiola faced a puzzle that would have paralyzed most managers. Bayern had not just won 1 or 2 trophies, they had claimed the fabled treble. To make matters worse, they hadn't just claimed a treble, it was one of the most dominant, ruthless trebles in history, as they marauded through Germany and Europe, including a 7-0 demolition of Pep's former club. So how exactly do you improve on perfection? The answer for most managers would have been to keep things basically the same, maybe introducing 1 or 2 tweaks to put their own signature on things. But Guardiola had spent a year in New York, watching, studying, recovering from the final years at Barcelona. His comeback season wouldn't be one of falling in line with the club's expectations. He was hungry to innovate, but this was a very different challenge. With Barcelona, he was a local lad who had inherited a giant in decline. It was chock full of young players ready to take on instruction. This, on the other hand, was a behemoth in its pomp, with well-established superstars who had no intention of being sold to allow Pep to reinvent the team. So publicly, Pep promised that he would be adjusting his approach to the players rather than the other way around. But was that what happened on the pitch? It did look like he was keeping his promise, as he just so ever slightly shifted away from Heinkes's tried and tested 4-2-3-1 to a 4-1-4-1, an almost imperceptible change. But within mere moments of entering the Bundesliga, disaster struck. Javi Martinez, one half of the double pivot that had conquered Europe, went down with injury and Pep grimaced. His move to a 4-1-4-1 had placed even more emphasis on the single pivot, and Martinez was going to be the hub for Bayern. Essentially Pep's Busquets in Germany, and now with his injury requiring surgery, that possibility was gone. The solution though was simple. Schweinsteiger would fill the role, because with Luis Gustavo having been shipped out, no one else could. Schweinsteiger was one of the finest German midfielders in a generation, and he was beloved by the Munich faithful. He had the engine required for the role on both sides of the pitch, good technically and was willing to get stuck in. But even this early in his managerial career, one thing was obvious about the Guardiola philosophy. The team would always rise and fall to the level of the deepest pivot. Schweinsteiger had the experience to take on the role seamlessly, and initially he did. But only a few matches later, he would go down with injury as well. A Pep team without an elite pivot available. It just couldn't function. He had to find a way to make it work. And he decided to take on one of the most insidious gambles that managers face. What do you do when you have a player who is undoubtedly world-class in one position but can do a job in another area? Do you move that player to their secondary position? Because now you risk turning that player who's world-class in their natural position to just one that is good in another. Despite the risk, Guardiola went over to potentially the world's best right back and said to him, "We need you in the midfield," a position that Lahm had essentially never operated in. It seemed insane. The pivot was the hub of every Guardiola team. This was the last position to be experimenting with. And at just 1.7 meters, Lahm didn't even look like he possessed the stature of a typical pivot. But just as Pep had traded a pivot with physicality and technicality for one who was almost all technicality, he once again showed a willingness to look beyond the obvious. He had realized that in the modern game, the pivot role was more mental than ever. So it's not that you needed your most physical or technical player in that role. You just needed your most intelligent.
Football is going to me is one of the best players I ever seen. He can play in 10 positions, no problems, because he understands the game perfectly.
Lahm repaid Guardiola's faith tenfold. He became the invisible spine of everything that followed, so much so that in future years, Pep's assistant would equate him to Xavi. When Bayern built from the back, Lahm would drop between the centre-backs, creating the temporary back three that had become Pep's trademark. But what made Lahm special in the role was his decision-making. He knew exactly where to position himself to best support the ball, when to play conservative safe passes, when to speed up the tempo, and when to take a touch, turn, and move the team up the pitch. Ahead of him, Schweinsteiger provided the physicality, shuttling up and down the pitch, while Toni Kroos was more stationary higher up in attack, looking to provide the killer pass. But Lahm wasn't the only one who seemed custom-made for Pep. Manuel Neuer was a significant upgrade on Victor Valdez on both sides of the ball, and needed no instruction to become his ideal ball-playing goalkeeper. And while the epicenter of his Barcelona side had been his star-studded midfield, for Bayern Munich there was no question that the superstars were out wide. And this would become a massive headache for Guardiola. Rodri was still amongst the best wide men in world football, and that did not change under Pep. Both had a lethal combination of flair and dribbling ability, as well as ruthless efficiency in the final third. But Pep was still Pep, and he needed a way to dominate the midfield, like he did at his old club. Where at Barcelona, he had the greatest of all time who could drop deep to create a midfield four. Things here were nowhere near as simple. Mario Mandzukic, good player though he was an archetypical centre-forward with little interest in dropping into the midfield, but he had finished the season prior as the club's top goal scorer. And yet, Pep was beginning to bring a lot more change than he had initially promised. The only player in the squad close to being able to play that floating nine role was Thomas Müller, and he did so expertly, though his interpretation differed to that of Messi. He got fewer touches than Messi and was less involved in the play, but still, his movement and ability to ghost into unconventional spaces consistently dragged defenders out of position. And despite Müller's ability, a second, more pressing issue presented itself, and it was to do with the number 9. Not 9 as in centre forward or false 9, but the actual number 9. See, out of 34 Bundesliga matches, Robben and Ribéry only started 9 matches together. And of those 9, only in 2 matches did they complete the full 90 together. Why was that? Injuries ravaged the pair, with Robben being forced to miss 8 games, while Franck Ribéry missed 15 through injury. But that wasn't always the reason they weren't playing together, as Ribéry would later bluntly put it. Despite his promise of minimal changes, Pep Guardiola's rotation policy was already rubbing some of the biggest stars who were used to being automatic starters regardless of form or schedule the wrong way. The reason didn't matter. The result was just that often, in the first 11, there were holes in the wide regions. And the first man selected to shift was Mr. Utility himself, as Thomas Müller was often tasked with filling in for whoever was missing. And up front, well, Bayern had just lured Germany's golden boy from rivals Dortmund, and Pep flirted with him at false 9 on more than a few occasions. But such was the overlap between the wingers' injuries that when both weren't available, Götze still found himself filling in out wide as well. All of this meant that when the dust settled, Mario Mandzukic still more often found himself as the centre forward, and the behaviour of the wingers affected the fullbacks. Robben was much likelier to hold the width, whereas Müller, Mr. Raumdeuter himself, would drift inside or even deep much earlier on in the piece, with Rafinha bombing on outside of him. But remember how we spoke about how some of the players seemed custom-made for Pep? Sure, one of them was Lahm, but high football IQ wasn't just limited to the right-sided fullback. The left-back would soon become his pet project. David Alaba had, for just over a year, established himself as the left back for the Bavarians, bombing up and down the flank in support of Franck Ribéry and allowing the Frenchman to cut in. And he still very much did that in Pep's debut season, especially if it was Müller or Götze beginning on the flanks. But Pep had also very clearly been keeping an eye on what the Austrian was doing for his national team, as he had slowly become a central midfielder on the international stage. And so curiously, when possible, especially when Ribéry was out wide, Pep got his left back to move infield a lot earlier, and the term inverted fullback began to be floated around in tactical circles. This positioning allowed Alaba to support Lahm in this zone, as he got accustomed to the new position, while at the same time providing the potential for ridiculous amounts of overloads, especially if Müller or Götze were on the pitch. But at the same time, it allowed Ribéry to stay out wide, trying to isolate the fullback, and when Mandzukic was on the pitch, they still had the option of swinging in the ball to the towering Croatian. But Ribéry would still of course thrive taking on his man out wide when possible. Bayern were winning, but behind the scenes, not everyone was happy. Because we should clarify, Alaba tucking in didn't allow Ribéry to stay wide, it compelled him to. Pep's approach to positional play meant that he would rarely ever want two men wide down the same flank. If Alaba inverted, Ribéry was forced to stay wide. If Alaba was wide, Ribéry was forced to move in. And these rules irked Ribéry. I don't need to be told do this and this. I need to be free on the pitch. I need face-to-face encounters. I need a motivating pad on the back, Ribéry would go on to say. For all these changes in attack, the real transformation came in defense. Or rather, in the aggressive absence of traditional defending. Heinkes's Bayern had been defensively excellent through shape and discipline. Compressed and organized, and especially in the biggest encounters, it was almost as though they were baiting the opponent high to allow them to spring on the counter. Pep looked at this structure and effectively said, instead of setting up to defend and counter, what if we just never let opponents have the ball in the first place? The five-man press became Bayern's calling card. Not a front three pressing with midfielders supporting somewhere in behind. No, Pep wanted 5 players hunting immediately. The striker, both the wingers, and crucially both advanced midfielders pushing up right alongside them. It created scenarios where opponents receiving the ball in their own half were immediately swarmed by red shirts. The pressing triggers were specific. When the ball went to the opposition's fullback, that was the signal. The ball side winger would sprint at them, cutting off the forward pass. The striker would angle their run to eliminate the pass inside. The near side midfielders would block the central passing lanes. The far side winger would tuck in, anticipating the hopeful diagonal. And Lahm, lurking just ahead of the centre backs, was positioned to intercept anything that made it through the first line. It was suffocating. But the real weapon wasn't even in the initial press. It was what happened after Bayern lost possession. 6 seconds. That's how long Pep gave his players to win the ball back after losing it. 6 seconds of absolute intensity, coordinated pressure, and refusing to let opponents breathe. The counterpress is a concept that's become mainstream now, but back then, Pep and Klopp were leading the revolution, bringing this pressing style back in vogue. When it worked, and it usually did, Bayern's attacks didn't really end. They just paused briefly before resuming from a higher position. Neuer became the libero that Guardiola always wanted, sweeping behind the high line and completing more passes than some opposing midfielders. His positioning was crucial. Bayern's defense often played 10 yards inside the opposition half, but Neuer's presence behind them meant that balls over the top could be dealt with before the forwards even reached them. Yet, for all of its intensity, the system had a fundamental vulnerability, and it centered around that single pivot. Lahm's intelligence masked the issue for long stretches, but the reality was unavoidable. One man covering that space in front of the defense meant that when the press was bypassed, and it would be bypassed eventually, Bayern was suddenly exposed. If Lahm stepped to close down a midfielder who'd received in space, the area behind him was now vulnerable. If he dropped to cover instead, he couldn't press at all, and suddenly Bayern were inviting the pressure. It was a problem that not even a player of Lahm's caliber could entirely solve alone. And yes, at times Thiago, Schweinsteiger and Kroos would drop in to be the secondary pivot, but usually only in deeper phases, because higher up the pitch, Pep had wanted them to push up into these creative zones. This is where Alaba's inversion became more than just a tactical innovation. It now became entirely necessary. By having the left back tuck in when Ribéry held the width, Pep could provide Lahm with the support he desperately needed. It wasn't quite a double pivot, but it gave Bayern an extra number in that crucial zone when transitions occurred. Alaba's football IQ meant that he understood when to invert and when to stay wide, providing Bayern with the flexibility to protect themselves without sacrificing their attacking intent entirely. But even this solution had its limits, because when they didn't have a traditional winger because of injuries, Alaba was forced to provide the width. Add to that, the Bundesliga, more than any other top European league at the time, was built on the counter-attack. Dortmund under Klopp were the obvious example. Their transitions were lightning quick, and their vertical passing was devastating. But it wasn't just Dortmund. Leverkusen, Schalke, and even mid-table sides had embraced counter-attacking football as their primary weapon. The German football culture rewarded directness, running, and immediate vertical thrust after winning the ball. Bayern would dominate matches, control possession, and create chances. Then one misplaced pass, one failed press, and suddenly they were racing back towards their own goal as the opposition charged into acres of space behind the high line. The league's counter-attacking emphasis meant that Bayern faced this danger week after week, game after game. And they did adapt and became better at managing it. And because of their superior quality, they never truly paid for it in the league. But the threat never really disappeared. And then came Real Madrid in the Champions League semi-final. And all those hairline cracks suddenly became chasms. Carlo Ancelotti had assembled a side perfectly designed to exploit everything that Bayern had struggled with. Pace in Gareth Bale and Ronaldo, technical security in Modric and Alonso, and crucially, the tactical discipline to sit in, absorb pressure, and explode on the counter. Madrid's goals were exhibitions in counter-attacking football. Bayern would push high, commit numbers forward, and then lose possession. Madrid would transition immediately, and suddenly it was 3 or 4 white shirts running at Bayern's defense, with only 2 or 3 left to defend. The high line that had been such an asset domestically became a liability against this level of speed and quality. It was a painful lesson, but one that would shape how Guardiola thought about defense going forward. When the dust settled on the season, the defensive record was actually impressive in isolation. Bayern had conceded the fewest goals in the league. Their pressing had created numerous turnovers and scoring chances. The system had worked more often than it had failed. But football isn't played in isolation. The very best teams, the ones that win Champions Leagues, find ways to exploit your weaknesses. Madrid had done just that. They had identified the trade-offs inherent in Pep's approach and punished them ruthlessly. And behind the scenes, there were already rumblings that Pep's style wasn't going over so well with established players. Pep's assistant would later reveal that many of the senior players were looking to overrule Pep. Guardiola had wanted a more controlled, closed approach against Madrid, but the players had overruled him and gone for something more direct. The season ended with domestic dominance and European disappointment. The Bundesliga title was claimed with games to spare, a procession rather than a race, but the Champions League exit lingered and took over the narrative. On paper, overall it was a good season, maybe even a great one, but it was not perfect. And perfection is why Bayern had hired Pep. Guardiola's mind was already racing ahead, identifying the next puzzle to solve, the next innovation to implement. The counter-attacking vulnerability could not be ignored, because standing still, even after a successful first season, would be moving backwards. Guardiola had spent the summer analyzing, dissecting, reimagining. His first season had been about proving he could work with Bayern's treble-winning DNA. His second would be about reshaping it entirely, to go full Pep, so to speak. There were some key changes, as Toni Kroos decided it was time to leave the Bavarians, but another classy reinforcement was quick to arrive, as Alonso made the opposite move. Bayern again pillaged their closest rivals, bringing in one of the finest forwards in the world in Lewandowski to bolster the front line. But the most significant acquisition was conceptual rather than personnel. Guardiola had been given permission from the board, from the fans, from himself to fully unleash his tactical imagination. Bayern Munich would use 12 different formations in the Bundesliga alone that season. 12. To put that in perspective, in Heinkes's final season, Bayern had used a 4-2-3-1 in 53 of 53 matches. In Pep's first season, there had been subtle variations, but essentially the 4-3-3 or the 4-1-4-1 was used in most matches. And importantly, they remained roughly in this structure, with minimal movement from the higher midfielders to move up the pitch or down the pitch, wingers cutting in late, and the occasional inversion. Now, the team sheet became almost meaningless, as players were constantly on the move. And it was another season where the Catalan was forced to adapt early. It looked initially like he planned to lean on the back three this season. And one of the key components of this would have been Javi Martinez, a defensive midfielder who was more than happy to drop one layer deeper to become a centre-back. His and Jerome Boateng's ball-playing ability would have made Bayern Munich immaculate in the build-up, if they weren't already. But all it took was 31 minutes to undo the plan. In the Super Cup against Dortmund, Martinez went down with an ACL injury that effectively ruled him out for the season. But why was Pep trying to shift to a 3? Many reasons, but one of them was an extra body to deal with the transition and prevent a repeat of what happened against Real and on occasion in the league in general. But without Martinez to help the progression from deep, Pep was a lot more conservative in his use of the back 3 and reverted to a 4 instead. So how could he still stop the counter in this setup? The answer came from the midfield. Whereas in prior seasons it was almost always Lahm as the single pivot with occasional help from a hybrid player, now Pep looked to almost always have a set double pivot, helped by the arrival of Xabi Alonso, no matter how much the cast rotated around him and Lahm, who was now a full-time midfielder. And we saw all sorts of different configurations from Pep, a 4-2-3-1, a 3-4-1-2, midfield diamonds, and on and on. But despite the changes in every match, the Guardiola fingerprints were clearer than ever. If it was a double pivot, if Ribéry was wide, Alaba would tuck in even more aggressively, which gave the Bavarians options. La Salida Lavolpiana was still at the heart of the Guardiola build-up, with Alonso dropping between the centre-back, still allowing Pep to have that back 3. And unquestionably, Alonso elevated the build-up. Lahm was tidy and kept things ticking over, but Alonso was a quarterback. A maestro. He could keep it simple when needed, but he was also quite press-resistant, again dissuading the opponent from the press. But his passing range unlocked new possibilities. Still, Bayern tended to have huge overloads through the center that compelled teams to want to defend as compactly as possible. Alonso now had the ability to find his wingers at will, and that would mean that Robben and Ribéry could be found in space to then attack the box. And if teams opted to defend wide instead, well, Alonso had the ability to pierce multiple lines with his passing to find any of the floating men between the lines in the center. But something sinister was at play. A quirk of Pep's first season was becoming a feature, and not a good one. The constant chopping and changing of both formation and personnel wasn't entirely due to Pep's eccentricities. The injury record had become frightening. In 14-15, Ribéry missed 53 games for club and country. Robben fared slightly better, missing 25. And again, out of 34 Bundesliga games, Ribéry only started together 8 times. And more of Pep's key men were suffering. Alaba missed 26, Thiago missed 36, and to top it off, even Lahm had his fair share of struggles, missing 18 games. The intensity of the Guardiola system was taking its toll on the bodies of his team, but Pep still looked to adapt. Of course, no Alaba meant less inversion into the midfield, and it was just as well, as the injuries to Ribéry and Robben meant that more traditional fullbacks in Rafinha and Juan Bernat bombing up and down the flanks were more necessary than ever as the wingers were moving infield. But the paradigm was clear. Pep could not depend on the threat to come from his superstar wide men consistently, and instead, he had to shift the focus to complete domination in the middle of the pitch. The Bavarians now had a world-class forward who would make the position his own. A major concern was whether he would be able to adapt, as at Barca, Pep had preferred a false 9, and in his first season, Mandzukic had been used almost as a result of injury. But Lewandowski looked to adapt quickly, and although it looked clunky at times, in addition to his pure finishing ability, Lewandowski was already working on his all-round game, dropping deep to assist the play whenever possible, although of course not to the level of a true false 9. It was an adaptation season for Lewandowski, ending with only 17 goals, but it was supplemented by Müller from out wide when Robben was injured, and Götze, almost a full-time winger in this season. And this played straight into Pep's plans. See, in training, Pep had been looking to split his pitch like this, and more he had been placing emphasis on these regions, the half spaces, and with the fullbacks providing the width, Müller and Götze would occupy these, and whenever Lewandowski drifted deep, both were happy to attack the goal. But Robben, despite his injury, when he did play, was still devastating as ever, with 17 goals and 7 assists in just 21 appearances in the league. And when he played, it was often Müller who would then move into an attacking midfield position, as Bayern would move to a more traditional 4-2-3-1. But not having Ribéry available often enough was a huge problem. Bayern missed the star power, the bite, the incision provided by these men. At times, the possession could be high, but the incision was missing. But with Lewandowski being joined by Müller drifting in from wide, Bayern still did always have the option to swing crosses in from the flanks. But the key in all of this was the more solid midfield in deeper areas, and never leaving a single pivot isolated. This could be by going with a more conservative Schweinsteiger-Lahm-Alonso trio, or having an inverter to join the double pivot. It all looked good. And then came Barcelona. the Champions League semi-final, a chance for revenge, and proof that Guardiola's evolution had solved the vulnerabilities that Madrid had exposed. And Pep devised perhaps the most radical tactical gambit of his entire career: man-to-man marking across the entire pitch. Against Barcelona, against Messi, Iniesta, Xavi, Neymar, Suarez. It was audacious to the point of madness. The logic did make sense in theory. If you press Barcelona in a zone, they'll find the spaces between your zone. If you sit deep against them, they'll circulate the ball until you make a mistake. So why not eliminate their time and space entirely? Assign each Barcelona player a Bayern shadow. Whenever they moved, Bayern moved with them. No space, no time, no oxygen. But the first leg at the Camp Nou descended into chaos almost immediately. Bayern were aggressive, physical, and constantly in Barcelona's faces. But individual duels are just that, individual. And when those duels include Lionel Messi and Neymar, betting on your defenders to win every single matchup is a gamble that only pays off if everything goes perfectly. And everything did not go perfectly. Barcelona were devastating. When even one Bayern player lost their individual duel, it created a numerical advantage for Barcelona that they exploited ruthlessly. The system had no safety net, no covering defenders or insurance policy. It was all or nothing, and Bayern came out with nothing. The defeat was damning in many ways that went beyond the scoreline. It suggested that perhaps there were limitations to innovation, that sometimes conventional approaches existed for good reasons. Critics pointed out that a more conservative approach might have matched up against Barcelona more effectively, but others noted that sitting deep and absorbing pressure simply wasn't in Pep's DNA. He'd rather fail pushing the boundaries rather than succeed playing it safe. It was his greatest strength and his most obvious weakness. The domestic season at least remained under control. Bayern claimed another Bundesliga title, though not quite with the same procession as the previous year. The DFB Pokal followed. A domestic double was secured. Respectable, professional, but expected. 2 years at Bayern, 2 semi-final exits. The tactical evolution that had produced so much innovation domestically hadn't solved the Champions League puzzle. Against the very best teams, Madrid, Barcelona, all of Bayern's weaknesses had been exposed. Pep had one more season at Bayern Munich. One more season to prove that he could conquer the Champions League. The pressure was mounting. The critics were circling. And Pep was already planning his next experiment. 2 semi-final exits. 2 years of domestic dominance paired with European frustration. The pattern was becoming uncomfortably familiar. Bayern Munich had conquered Germany with a ruthlessness that bordered on boring, but they needed to fix the Champions League. That's the problem with taking over a team that had already achieved perfection. At best, you could only match their prior achievements and hope to do it in better style. And Pep would do everything in his power to make it a reality. The summer business reflected this mindset. Douglas Costa, Arturo Vidal, Kingsley Coman. Joshua Kimmich was perhaps the most interesting arrival of all. The youngster didn't know it yet, but he would be converted from his natural midfield role into something a lot more interesting. Pep saw in the 20-year-old German what he'd seen in Lahm years earlier: the intelligence to operate anywhere, the technical security to play from the back, and the positional understanding to fill in multiple roles within one match. Pep had his eyes on perfection and knew that chopping and changing was not going to get them to that required level. The formation settled, and more often than not it was a 4-3-3 or a variant thereof. Lahm was moved back to right back, and it was Boateng's turn to struggle with injury, and depending on the occasion, he would be replaced by either David Alaba or Kimmich. Again, the principles were in place from Pep. It was the finer tactical details that he was looking to cover. Now, with Lahm as the permanent starting right back once again, and when possible with Alaba on the other side, inverted fullbacks became a fixture pushing alongside Alonso. And of course both of these were technical enough and smart enough that they could play these roles better than most midfielders. The most important thing is that this dedicated 2-3 shape gave him the necessary rest defense shape, a layered back five that essentially made them even harder to penetrate on the counter-attack. And this was vital for a few reasons. When Thiago was available, he could drop a little bit deeper when required to assist Alonso and Lahm, but he was often injured, so it was often a Müller and Vidal pairing ahead of the Spaniard. And one of the main reasons Arturo Vidal was brought in is where in the prior season, the midfield play could begin to look overly slow and overly controlled. Vidal brought selective chaos. He had the engine and the willingness to consistently push higher up the pitch and drop deeper as needed. Alongside him was Müller, as elusive as ever. So these three deeper meant that they could keep possession almost effortlessly. And that brings us onto one of the marquee recruitment areas for Pep. The wingers in the prior season Both Goethe and Muller often found themselves drifting into central areas, leaving the fullbacks to provide the width. Not only did that make them more predictable in their motions, but it also meant that there was no threat from out wide, because for the most part, the best that the wide fullbacks could do was just swing in across. The cavalry now, in Coman and Costa on the other hand, were in their element out wide, almost gluing themselves to the sideline. That the aging Robben and Ribéry partnership increasingly couldn't provide for 90 minutes. And crucially, both could operate on either flank, giving Pep the flexibility to rotate without sacrificing his tactical coherence. The width was non-negotiable. Guardiola had learned from the prior season that if the wingers drifted inside too early, the attack became too narrow, too easy to defend by simply compressing the central areas. Now, by keeping the touchline wingers wide until the ball entered the final third, Bayern forced opponents to defend the entire width of the pitch. Then and only then would the rotations begin. So where before the opponent knew their job was to protect the center and force the fullbacks to get on the ball, now, if they tried to do similar, the elite wingers had isolation opportunities and space to run at their fullback. And the numbers speak for themselves, as the pair had the highest completed dribbles per 90 in the league. So what was the solution? Well, sure, they could expand their defensive shape, especially because the wingers were wide rather than adding numbers into the box. But that's where the personnel in the midfield made all the difference. Just as Pep liked, Arturo Vidal and Thomas Muller tended to stick primarily in the half spaces. But the difference is, now both of these midfielders were highly offensive. Muller was always seeking the defender's blind side and ghosting into the box before they could react. Vidal, through sheer force of will, used his relentless running to crash into the box and arrive in the perfect place to finish. Lewandowski's role became even more nuanced in this final season. In the 2-3-5, he wasn't just the target man or the false nine. He was the reference point whose movements dictated everyone else's positioning. When he dropped deep into the midfield, it was a signal for Muller to move beyond him into the striker's position. When he pulled wide left, Costa would cut inside. When he made a run across the defensive line towards the back post, it created room at the near post for whoever was arriving late from the midfield. His adaptation period was over. This was Lewandowski 2.0, and he would rip through the league, scoring almost twice the amount he did in his first season with the Bavarians. The defensive structure remained largely unchanged from the previous season. Bayern still pressed aggressively, still sought to win the ball back within 6 seconds of losing it, still maintained that suffocating intensity that had defined Guardiola's entire tenure. On the defensive end of things, the inverted fullbacks were key. Having Lahm and Alaba in these regions when Bayern attacked meant that they were already central when possession was lost. This meant that Bayern could immediately engage their counterpress, knowing that they had strong security from this layer in the midfield. Neuer's sweeper-keeper role remained fundamental. He was typically well off his line, and this allowed him to clear any balls over the top before opposition forwards reached them. But it also made him a crucial part of Bayern's build-up, the 11th outfielder who could receive under pressure and play out. But once again, Bayern paid for this insatiable desire to win the ball back. Injuries ravaged the squad. Robben, Ribéry, Martinez, Thiago, Benatia, Goetze all faced prolonged spells out of action. Yet Bayern still won the Bundesliga. Again. They claimed the title with games to spare, and again the Pokal followed. Another domestic double. But once again, this was becoming increasingly routine. But Europe told a different story. The Champions League exit against Atletico Madrid exposed the same vulnerability that had plagued Pep's entire Bayern tenure. Elite teams sitting deep and breaking fast. In that tie, Atleti were masters of defensive organization. Simeone had refined the low block into an art form. 2 banks of 4, compact and disciplined, absorbing pressure and then exploding on the counter. Bayern dominated possession as always, created chances as always, but struggled to break down the well-drilled defense. The Guardiola Bayern Munich era was over, but at that moment it felt incomplete, like his tenure had ended not with failure but with unfinished business. He had changed how football was played, influenced a generation of coaches, and revived tactical concepts that would become mainstream. But the Champions League, the ultimate validation, it eluded him. He would leave for Manchester City, with some questions lingering over his head. Could his philosophy win the Champions League again? Or would it always be exploitable by teams willing to sit deep and strike fast? The answers would have to wait for England. But can he do it in the Premier League? The question had been floated for years every time a Pep side got a little bit too much praise. Drawing pretty pictures on the pitch was all well and good on the continent, but the Premier League was all about physicality. The tackles would come flying in long before one of his 20-side sequences ever began. At least that was the theory. In 2016, when Pep was unveiled, opinion was split. Many were sure that Pep was the real deal and would have no trouble leading City to success, while others declared that he would have to adapt his style to the physicality of the league, or failure was guaranteed. But City had been doing everything they could to ensure that their man would be successful, even before he had officially taken the job. Ferran Soriano, Txiki Begiristain, both Barcelona alumni who understood Pep's football philosophy intimately, had been reshaping City's infrastructure since 2012. They had signed players with Guardiola in mind. Kevin De Bruyne and Raheem Sterling weren't panic buys to appease Pellegrini. They were actually carefully selected pieces of the Pep puzzle that hadn't yet been revealed to the public. And this was a different challenge. Pep was taking on a team that had recent enough successes but had not won the league in 2 seasons. And the citizens had only qualified for the Champions League on goal difference the season prior. But unlike the last struggling heavyweight he had taken over, Barcelona, he didn't even have the benefit of youth, with most of the squad being into their 30s. As always, Pep did not waste time reshaping the squad to fit his vision. İlkay Gündoğan arrived from Borussia Dortmund, a midfielder who could operate in tight spaces and circulate possession with precision. Leroy Sané came in from Schalke, raw but devastatingly quick. Nolito provided experience, and Stones' almost £50 million move from Everton raised eyebrows across England. That was a lot of money for a defender who couldn't defend properly, the critics said. But Guardiola didn't want just a defender. He wanted a centre-back who could play. And then came the most divisive signing of all. Claudio Bravo arrived from Barcelona to replace Joe Hart, the England #1, beloved by City fans, a symbol of the club's rise to the top, was deemed surplus to requirements. Guardiola had declared Joe Hart guilty before the Englishman had even had time to defend himself. Hart's crime? Well, it was his feet. Guardiola needed his goalkeeper to be the first playmaker, capable of receiving under pressure and playing accurate passes into the midfield. Hart, a 4-time Golden Glove winner, could not provide the foundation, Pep decided. It was ruthless, but it was also completely consistent with everything Guardiola had ever done. Personnel would always be secondary to the team. Guardiola's tactical vision for Manchester City was not mysterious. He had been an elite manager for 8 seasons now, with a playing philosophy that was obvious even to casual observers. The principles remained constant: dominate possession through positional superiority, create numerical advantages in every zone of the pitch, press aggressively to win the ball high, and circulate possession until the opposition's defensive structure cracked. And Pep looked to implement some similar patterns, with the centre-backs dropping deep alongside Bravo to begin the play. And the importance of Bravo was clear right from the outset, as he ensured that numerical overload. The Spaniard was accustomed to playing under pressure and had no problem beginning the play, with Fernandinho dropping in from pivot to assist. But this was where things began to go wrong in the build-up. Pep's first-choice centre-back pairing would have been Stones and captain Vincent Kompany, but the Belgian spent most of his time with the physio, meaning it was Otamendi alongside Stones instead, 2 right-footed centre-backs. This can work provided that the left-sided centre-back is extremely good with the ball at their feet, and able to play with their left or be able to maneuver the ball quickly with their right. Think Ramos, Piqué, or Van Dijk. But Otamendi was not that. And that was a weakness that opponents identified almost immediately. They structured their press accordingly. As much as possible, they would look to funnel the initial play to Otamendi, and then more importantly apply pressure to keep the Argentine on his left foot. This effectively cut off half the pitch when City built from the left side, as now it forced a less capable on-the-ball defender onto his weaker foot, often resulting in just a safe pass to the left back or forcing him to attempt riskier passes on his weak foot. It also made it much harder for Otamendi to switch the play, making City's play much more predictable. This, of course, only got worse when Fernandinho dropped in, as it forced Otamendi even further to the left, although the new advantage was that they now had an overload, which was the 3 versus 2. But even that came with sacrifices. If Fernandinho was dropping deep, it left a highly technical but lightweight midfield 2 ahead of him, meaning it would be much harder to create any overloads in these regions, especially because Sergio Aguero had morphed into a fully traditional forward who preferred to stay high up the pitch. Pep was looking for solutions in multiple ways. Alexander Kolarov had been at the club for years now, but he was a left-back through and through. But Pep chose to move the Serbian to left centre-back, particularly when Stones was injured, meaning that City now had a left-footed centre-back. And in possession, it did have the desired effect. City could now build through both centre-backs, knowing that the pitch would be opened up for both centre-backs on their strong feet. And for Kolarov in particular, the long diagonal was one of his major weapons, meaning that City did have some unpredictability. But the Blues still had had issues in the midfield, as well as the fullback areas. All three of the remaining fullbacks were well into their 30s, and asking them to do shifts moving up and down the flanks for 90 minutes would have been ambitious at best. And this was paired with the issue of City only having two midfielders if Fernandinho dropped into the first line. Pep decided to kill two birds with one stone, using the same methods that had served him so well in Germany. He instructed both of his fullbacks to move into the midfield, maybe even more aggressively and more often than he had with the Bavarians. This meant that the fullbacks, rather than those long sprints, were making much smaller movements into the midfield, while at the same time granting Fernandinho that freedom for La Salida Lavolpiana, knowing that there would still be a midfield four ahead of him, and that four could be a five if Fernandinho did stay higher. And the new squad had been completely unfamiliar with his method, so Pep was even stricter about his structures, and in training he had this 20-zone system almost permanently painted onto the pitch, and the rules were clear. No more than 3 players on a horizontal line, and no more than 2 players in the same vertical line. So the inversion by the fullbacks did not automatically solve all of the problems. The inversion meant that the wingers now had to hug the touchline in that first phase, and early on in the season it was Raheem Sterling down the right and Nolito wide left. Sterling could stick to this position, but Nolito down the left was more akin to an inside forward, right-footed and wanting to play as close to the centre forward as possible. So he tended to drift in early, which meant because of Pep's positional rules, now Clichy had to move out wide, reducing that solidity through the centre of the pitch when facing counterattacks. And it's no wonder why, by the end of the season, it was Sane, a more traditional wide man, who was asked to hug the flanks in this position. This still didn't address one of the massive problems in the City shape. Sure, the shape looked close enough to Bayern's, but there was a massive difference in this zone. Alaba and Lahm excelled in these positions because they were excellent technically and could keep up with the high-pressure environment of the central midfield. Clichy, Sagna and Zabaleta most certainly could not. If opponents cut off the pass into Fernandinho, it meant either forcing the centre-backs to make those risky passes, but more importantly, pressing teams did not mind too much when these two were on the ball, because they presented extremely limited progressive ability, as well as almost no creative threat either, massively slowing down the play, and at the same time, they made 2 easy press targets. David Silva and De Bruyne could drop deeper to assist this, but this would mean the carefully constructed positional shape was beginning to change too much, as well as having an attacking midfielder in this position, meaning there was a much bigger chance of the rest of the defensive shape being broken through. And this midfield conundrum is something that Pep spent a lot of his debut season trying to figure out. One of the solutions was increasing the overload by looking to have a forward drop in. But unlike Barca, where he'd had an actual false 9, or Bayern, where initially Müller would have been an emergency false 9, with Aguero, Pep once again found himself confronted with a traditional forward. And things began to quickly devolve. The Argentine was the king of Manchester, with his reputation with City fans already solidified, and his work rate when it came to pressing or linking up the play had diminished. But Pep was not coming into a team that was coming off the back of unprecedented success. It was a team going through a transitional period, and it was a club that had moved mountains to get him in. Pep had ultimate power. Previous City managers had built the team around Aguero's strengths, his movement in the box, his clinical finishing, his ability to create something from nothing. But Pep still wanted more. He wanted his striker to be the first defender, pressing the opposition's deepest midfielder, or even their centre-backs. He wanted positional discipline, staying central to pin the centre-backs. He wanted holder play, and he wanted link-up combinations. And Aguero very quickly found himself seeing more of the bench than ever before. His replacement? Often, it was a midfielder, with the likes of Kevin De Bruyne taking up the role for key matches, with either Yaya Toure or Gundogan coming in, meaning that City would be able to hold onto the ball for longer spells due to this midfield overload. The drawback, of course, was the lack of cutting edge in these scenarios. And that was a big reason that City dipped into the market to try and find the best of both worlds. Gabriel Jesus arrived from Palmeiras with a twinkle in his eye and the energy to boot. The young Brazilian was everywhere, and in possession, he was more than willing to drop into the midfield to make up the numbers and still give them that cutting edge in the box. And he started on fire, but soon disaster struck. Gabriel Jesus went down with injury. Aguero was back in, and the Argentine continued to find out just how much he would need to adapt. And slowly, he began to. The goals were never a problem for Aguero, and they continued to flow, but we saw more of him linking up the play, as well as on the defensive end. And that brings us onto City's defensive system in general. When they lost the ball, the instinct was still to counterpress, but already some issues were presenting themselves. If the younger sides of Barcelona and Bayern Munich at times struggled to keep up with the intensity, what could be expected from the City side? Well, when it worked, it was the brilliant counterpressing football the world had become accustomed to from Guardiola, with sky blue shirts buzzing around the opponent immediately, forcing turnovers and getting back in possession. It could be ruthlessly efficient, particularly when the likes of Jesus were leading the press, and the citizens would end the season with a ridiculous 6.4 passes per defensive action, meaning upon losing the ball, the opponent only averaged just over 6 passes before City were able to put a tackle in, and that number was even lower than Jurgen Klopp's pressing machine. The problem was consistency. For the system to function, every element had to be synchronized. If Aguero was slow to commit and a centre-back escaped, the opposition now had the overload in the midfield. And Fernandinho, partnered with Silva and De Bruyne, was already being asked to do an inordinate amount of defensive work. But this is where the aging fullbacks were truly a problem. They had neither the intensity to back up the counter-press, nor the pace to recover into their positions, meaning not only was there space behind the fullbacks to attack, the centre-backs were being asked to cover ridiculous amounts of ground. It even led to Navas being played at right back for long spells, just to give City some sort of recovery pace. The Champions League tie against Monaco in February encapsulated everything: the offensive brilliance and the defensive chaos. For all of City's attacking prowess, scoring 6 goals across the 2 legs, they had holes everywhere in their defense. The holes that one of the generation's finest strikers in Falcao was ready to exploit. And he was backed up by a future grade of the game in Mbappe, who used his pace behind the shoddy defense to his advantage. It all meant that Monaco also scored 6 goals themselves, knocking City out on away goals. The scrutiny on Pep was ever increasing throughout the season. His opening run of 10 wins in a row seemed like a distant memory, as results turned in the league and the Champions League. A run of just 4 wins in 15 matches, the worst of his career, saw the citizens slide further and further back, as questions about Pep's ability to adapt to the league and his physicality swirled.
I have to understand the rules here in England. I know you are a specialist, but I have to understand it.
And the pressure seemed to be getting to Pep.
You don't seem that happy that you've won.
More than you believe. More than you believe, I'm happy.
You aren't showing it.
I'm so happy, believe me. I'm so happy. Happy New Year.
Are Manchester City still in the title race?
Yesterday, no. Why today was in the title race?
Thanks, Pep.
Our pleasure.
City would go on to finish 3rd that season, the lowest league finish of his career, and it would be Pep's first trophyless season. And yet, even in his lowest moment, a closer look at the underlying numbers revealed signs of hope. When looking at expected points, City, quote-unquote, should have won the league. But there were a few issues. While they scored roughly in line with their XG, they conceded 9 more goals than expected. 9. The reason for that? Well, when Bravo had arrived in Manchester, he brought all his ball-playing ability with him, but somehow left his hands in Barcelona. The result? City conceded preventable goal after preventable goal. On the other hand, the teams ahead of them had freak seasons. Second place Spurs scored 15 more than their XG over the season, while also conceding 8 less than expected. At the same time, champions Chelsea scored 23 more than expected, in another statistical anomaly. Pep had taken the season to observe the tactical landscape and bed in. But the question still loomed. Were the skeptics right? Perhaps Pep ball just didn't work in England. Guardiola would do everything in his power to change that narrative.
One trophyless season was all Pep Guardiola needed to identify every flaw in his squad. And if one thing is consistent with Guardiola throughout his career, it's that if you're no longer fit for his philosophy, or you detract from the team in any way, you will be disposed of and never thought of again. The keeper who could play but not save was immediately demoted, and a true maverick in Edison came in. City participated in the raiding of the supremely talented Monaco team, with Bernardo Silva joining the fray. But the other Monaco arrival showed the true intention of Pep, as Benjamin Mendy came in as well. He was just one part of the puzzle, as Pep knew that the major area that killed any chance of his success in his debut campaign was the old fullbacks. The former Monaco left-back was joined by 2 other fullbacks in Danilo and Kyle Walker, and the idea in Pep's mind was crystal clear. He accepted that he didn't have the same technicality in his fullbacks both last season and in this season that he had in the past, as none of these fullbacks could match up to the ball-playing ability of Lahm and Alaba. But what his new fullbacks did have was supreme athletic ability, and they were able to get up and down the pitch for 90 minutes, no problem, so it only made sense to stick them as wide as possible. But no inversion meant that the rest defense was at risk, with Fernandinho still having the potential of being overloaded, as Silva and De Bruyne stuck higher than ever. So rather than stacking the second line of the rest defense, Pep instead opted for a back three, having a 3-1 shape in the build-up and the rest defense. And the real beauty came up front. De Bruyne and Silva flourished in these spaces, but more importantly, Jesus had earned a starting position alongside Aguero, meaning that City would have a dual threat up top. More importantly, on the defensive end of things, Aguero now had a sprightly oppressor alongside him, meaning he had less work to do as he was only covering a single centre-back in this more efficient pressing shape. Pep would use a back three in 3 of the first 4 league matches, with Sterling and Sane suffering as they had no natural position on the pitch. But Pep's familiar foe, injury, would strike again. Matchday 7, a crucial part of his system, went down. An ACL injury to Benjamin Mendy. The Frenchman would be out for practically the entire season, and the system had to change. See, the formation had changed when Pep had moved to a back three, but the principles were consistent, having 2 players providing extreme width, except it was the wing-backs instead of the wingers. In his recruitment, Pep had gone heavier for right-backs, and Mendy was the only out-and-out left-back in the squad. And sure, Danilo could play as a right-footed left-back, but as a wing-back he just did not have the natural ability to run in behind or deliver with his left foot, which was absolutely required for a sole width provider. Against Everton, Pep had already experimented with having Sane as the left wing-back, but perhaps it was no coincidence that that was the only match they had dropped points in that season, and it was an omen that Pep could not afford to ignore. He had to get creative, and with no viable left wing-back, Pep shifted back to a back four, meaning that Sterling and Sane returned to being fixtures, and the easy option would have been to have Danilo move to left-back and revert to the exact same tactical setup that had led to City finishing 3rd a season prior. But Pep did not want the easy option, he wanted the effective one. Fabian Delph, who had barely played 1,000 league minutes in the past 2 seasons combined, would become the unlikely solution. The Englishman had an engine and was left-footed, so theoretically he could have been a makeshift wing-back and City could have kept the same back three shape. But Pep saw the opportunity to reinstate genuine menace from out wide by reverting to a back four and having the speed demons provide the width. Delph, from left back, had something the other fullbacks lacked, which was genuine ball-playing ability. So Pep had him invert just like Alaba at Bayern, and with Sterling back hugging the touchline, the rules of Pep's 20-zone system meant that Walker also had to invert, and City used a 2-3-5 shape in most attacking situations. The league was a step behind, desperately trying to figure out the citizens. They tried to press high, looking to disrupt the play before it even began. The City centre-backs would split, drawing the press even higher, and the forwards stayed as high as possible, usually past the halfway line from goal kicks. The issue, as opposition teams would soon find out, was that where normally positioning forwards this high up would be useless, City's new goalkeeper had a cannon in his left foot and could find these forwards easily. More importantly, when he did, it wasn't a looping long ball that floated down, giving the defense time to recover. It was an arrow that found its mark with unerring accuracy, meaning that City could play over the press. Defenses were forced to drop deeper in the first phase, but all that did was increase the space here, where Edison again had the accuracy to chip a ball into the midfield. And if teams began to drop deep, well, the 2-3-5 was in full effect, as City would pin the opponent deep. There was less and less need for Fernandinho to drop deep, as the opposition conceded that pressing in the first phase was useless, so the Brazilian could fully focus on dictating the midfield. And to his relief, alongside him, Delph was now a genuine technical option, who was more press-resistant than the inverted fullbacks of a season prior. And while Walker was never renowned for his technicality, he kept things simple enough that he did not actively harm or slow down the build-up play like the right-backs before him. But the real daggers were further forward. Sterling and Sane had one non-negotiable instruction: hug the touchline. Not drift wide occasionally, not come inside to combine. Touchline for 90 minutes in the first 2/3 of the pitch. This stretched defenses to breaking point. Opposition fullbacks had to stay wide, which opened up spaces for Silva and De Bruyne, and those two were now liberated. They did not have to drop deep as often in the build-up play, now that Fernandinho had more reliable help around him, so they could stay high, constantly threatening between the lines. City effectively had 5 attackers permanently stationed in the opponent's half. Against most teams playing a back four, it created a 5 versus 4 advantage that simply could not be defended. Mark the wingers tight, and we saw one of the most devastating patterns of play, as Silva and particularly De Bruyne would make non-stop runs into the half space to receive, and the low-drilled cross by De Bruyne for a tap-in became a recurring image for the City faithful. This was also backed by his ability to deliver from the deeper areas, as this section of the pitch became the De Bruyne zone, as he swung in pinpoint cross after pinpoint cross onto the feet and heads of gleeful attackers. But granting the wingers the room instead was just as disastrous. Sterling and Sane were no longer as raw as the prior season, and instead had become finely tuned weapons. Down the left, Sane's acceleration meant that he could tear in behind a fullback at any time, but he also had the dribbling ability to get past his man at a moment's notice. Sterling could do similar down the right, but he had developed a real appetite for goal, learning to find himself in the right place at the right time to finish off long passing sequences. Their refinement showed in the numbers, as both men hit double figures for both goals and assists in the league. And all of this was topped off by the centre forwards. Aguero, when fit, had adapted to the manager's needs, bringing an increased willingness to drop deep and help the midfield overload, as well as drag defenders out of position to give his teammates even more room to arrow into, something which Jesus naturally did when he was in the lineup, though with a lot less efficiency in his finishing. And defensively, the transformation was just as stark. The previous season, City had conceded 10 more goals than expected. Bravo's howlers, the aging fullbacks caught out of position, and the high line were exploited repeatedly. But now they conceded the fewest shots per game in the league. The in-possession structure was also a defensive structure. The 2-3-5 shape meant that there were always 5 players in the catchment area, positioned to stop counterattacks immediately. Fernandinho, Walker, and Delph as the first line of defense, with 2 centre-backs waiting in case of emergency. Against most teams who left 1, 2, or maybe 3 forwards high up, City's 5 defenders were ready to smother any transition. And just like the season prior, when City lost possession, the counter-press was immediate and coordinated. The player closest to the ball would press at an angle, cutting out the easiest passing option. His teammates would collapse the space around the ball, giving the opposition no time, no space, no easy outlet. City's passes per defensive action remained exceptionally low. But the real insurance policy was Edison. His positioning just outside his box meant that any ball over the top was his to clear. So the high defensive line that had been vulnerable the prior season, well, Edison's sweeping ability made it viable. Opposition forwards couldn't just run in behind anymore because he was already there, ready to clear. And Walker's pace, on the other hand, was a safety net. When City's press was bypassed, he could now recover at sprint speed. It was the culmination of a team having gelled and several players hitting their peak. Otamendi, who had looked shaky just a season prior, was suddenly superhuman. Fernandinho continued to do the impossible. Silva and De Bruyne created ruthlessly, and it all led to the City side going down in history. The first and only team to get 100 points in a single league season. And they broke a slew of records along the way. Pep Guardiola had proven emphatically that his philosophy could not just survive in England, it could dominate and rewrite the history books. The Champions League, however, still proved elusive, as City were dominated by Jurgen Klopp's Liverpool in the quarter-finals. The Holy Grail still eluded him, and Pep Guardiola wanted his City side to not just conquer the Premier League, but also Europe and the world.
Defending a title is harder than winning it. That's the cliche anyway. But Pep Guardiola had just rewritten the record books with 100 points, and the assumption was City would simply roll on, crushing everything in their path once again. The reality would be far more complicated. Liverpool were coming. Jurgen Klopp had spent the past few seasons building a monster. Alisson and Van Dijk appeared to be the final pieces, and they were determined to bring the Premier League back to Anfield for the first time in eons. And the summer business had been relatively quiet. Riyad Mahrez arrived from Leicester for £60 million, giving City elite depth on the wings. Benjamin Mendy was fit again after his ACL nightmare, and the assumption was City would continue with the same tactical blueprint that had demolished the league. But football doesn't work that way. Opponents had spent a season studying the Centurions. They knew the patterns, the triggers, the movements. Guardiola would have to evolve. Again. And guess what one of the major reasons for this was? Bingo. It was injury. First, it was Benjamin Mendy, who after a few games fit, would spend even longer out of commission than he had the previous season. But the Blues had experience in dealing with this absence. But the second major injury was like a dagger through the heart. After a relatively injury-free career, it would be De Bruyne's turn to go down. A ligament injury with a bunch of downstream effects that would lead him to miss 36 games across all comps that season. Pep was forced to shuffle his pieces once again. The left-back situation seemed straightforward, with Fabian Delph resuming his inverted wing-back role from the prior season. But who would it be through the centre of the pitch to replace one of the greatest midfielders the league has seen? Pep would look to Bernardo Silva, the man who had been operating primarily wide off the right for Monaco. The Portuguese wasn't unfamiliar with playing through the centre and immediately took to the role, and his technicality stood out even in the Premier League, with an uncanny ability to hold on to the ball and turn presses. The perfect Pep press-resistant player. But there was a problem. Both of these midfielders were generational, but there was a difference between them. When it came to the final ball, David Silva was as incisive as the best of them, but outside of the final third, he was happy to keep it simpler, rotating possession and running rings around the opposition. De Bruyne, on the other hand, was the risk taker, always looking for the lethal pass and the lethal shot at all times during the game. Bernardo Silva leaned towards the possession retention end of the spectrum, and this had to be accounted for, as there was now less threat through the midfield. One of the areas that felt the impact of this was the left-back Fabian Delph. Despite an impressive 17-18 season, in 18-19 his form would begin to tail off badly, and when he was sent off against Leicester, it was the final straw for Pep, and after that match, Delph would only play 10 more minutes in the league for him. His replacement? Another left-footed midfielder, this time in Alexander Zinchenko, who was thrust into first-team action at the drop of a dime. Zinchenko was more than comfortable. In fact, he preferred playing in the inverted role, as he was much more technical than physical. But Pep knew that with less goal-scoring and creative threat from the dual 8 in KDB's absence, teams were finding it easier to defend against them. They needed more threats closer to Aguero, and the man who would suffer because of this was Leroy Sané. Initially, Pep had stuck with his usual layout, with the twin wingers hugging the touchlines, but that now had to change. Less creative and box-penetrating threat from the 8 meant that Pep reverted to inverted wingers. Raheem Sterling cutting in from the left, Riyad Mahrez doing similarly from the right. The two wingers were dynamic, but the most important thing is they were generally closer to the goal and to the centre forward, giving them the opportunity not just to finish for themselves, but also to create for others. So the use of width had to be strategic. Despite his midfield skill set, Zinchenko actually did spend a lot of his time high up the pitch as a traditional fullback, providing the width when Sterling was cutting in. And there was nuance between how the wingers behaved. Sterling, if off the left, was very much an inside forward, wanted to attack the ball and the box as much as possible himself. Mahrez had always been inverted, so was happy to start a lot wider and get past a man or two before hitting the byline to cut the ball back, or if he cut infield, he was more than happy to cross to the back post or look for the shot. And it's just as well that he liked spending time wide, because having Walker's pace deep was still absolutely essential to prevent the counter-attack, so the Englishman could not provide the width. Add to that the fact that Walker wasn't a particularly menacing crosser from high up the pitch, it meant that an overlapping Walker would not have moved the needle much. And when the Algerian did move inside, it was Bernardo Silva, who much like De Bruyne was happy to overlap down the right temporarily, who ensured the team had balance. The impact of the wide men was incredible, with Sterling, Mahrez and Sané combining for 34 goals and 24 assists in the league. All of this was supplemented by City's ever-solid midfield, as even the linchpin of the City team, Fernandinho, struggled badly with injury towards the tail end of the season. And Gundogan stepped in effortlessly, providing even more press resistance from this deeper zone, as City would occasionally shift to a 4-2-3-1 in his absence to make up for the lack of the Brazilian's defensive brilliance. But maybe the most important tactical tweak was on the defensive end of things. Throughout his career, the remit had been simple from Pep. Press, press, and press until you can press no more. And even then, continue pressing. But this was the first season that Pep took his foot off the gas slightly. Instead of always reverting to the 4-3-3 high-intensity press, Pep shifted to a 4-4-2, with the role of David Silva being to move up alongside Aguero. The front two were beginning to age, so by working in conjunction as a pair, they had smaller spaces to press, saving their legs for the attacking end of things. And this was backed by having two midfielders behind them who had the energy to cover for 90 minutes. So they were slightly less intense in the press, but more solid, protecting the centre, and the system worked, and it led to the highest quality title race in league history. The run-in was brutal, City and Liverpool both winning every week, and the gap was never more than a point or two. The pressure would have cracked most teams, not this City. Brighton away in early May, City needed to win, and they did, comfortably. Liverpool won their match too, still level. Leicester away, last day of the season. City still needed points to retain the title. The tension was unbearable. Leicester held strong, and then Vincent Kompany drove forward and launched one from distance. Top corner, game over, title decided. 97 points, and no title for Liverpool. The margin between these two sides was microscopic, and it came down to the ability to adapt tactics even when the best players were injured. And the honours didn't stop there. The domestic treble was the cherry on top. The League Cup was won in February and the FA Cup secured in May. City became the first men's team to complete the domestic treble. It looked like an unstoppable upward trajectory for City and Pep. And then came 2019-2020. Pep Guardiola's Manchester City tenure had been defined by the ability to adapt to injury. Mendy's ACL in 16-17 had forced the Delft solution that unlocked the Centurions. De Bruyne missing huge chunks of 18-19 had elevated Bernardo Silva and forced the wingers to carry more creative burden. Each time, Pep had found solutions that had somehow made City better. But some injuries can't be solved. They just expose everything. Aymeric Laporte went down against Brighton in August with knee ligament damage that would force him to miss 20 league games. The scaffolding holding up City's entire defensive structure was gone in an instant. And this time, there was no clever tactical workaround waiting. Company had left in the summer, and Pep had chosen not to replace him, trusting in the three centre-backs, Laporte, Stones and Otamendi, with Fernandinho as emergency cover. Without Laporte, and with Stones struggling with injuries of his own, that emergency became the default. And with it came a cascade of problems that would ultimately derail the entire season. Fernandinho moved to left centre-back, and the issues started immediately. In 18-19, Laporte had been the rock in the defence, making the PFA Team of the Year. He was physical, he could play, and maybe most importantly, he was left-footed. Against those pressing forwards, he loved to drive past them, and the entire pitch opened up on his left foot for him to fully express his passing range. Fernandinho, on the other hand, was right-footed and was now playing on his wrong side in an already unfamiliar position. It created the same asymmetry that had plagued City back in the 16-17 season with Otamendi. When pressed by the opposition forward, Fernandinho's passing angles off of his stronger foot were cut off. His progressive numbers dropped compared to Laporte the previous season. He had fewer progressive passes, fewer progressive carries, and less confidence bringing the ball out. But that was just the first domino. Rodri had arrived from Atletico Madrid to replace Fernandinho in the pivot. On paper, it was perfect succession planning, and we know what Rodri would go on to become. But in 1920, Rodri was not that. In fact, he was nowhere near. So the Laporte and Stones injuries had not just decreased the quality at centre-back, it had removed the best pivot in the league from Pep's Arsenal as well. And let's be clear, even then, Rodri was superb on the ball, the ideal metronome for recycling possession, but he was essentially a rotational passer. Short, safe, simple. Where Fernandinho would break lines with vertical passes or carry the ball forwards, Rodri kept it taking over. Despite making 22% more passes than Fernandinho had managed in the same position in the prior season, Rodri made fewer progressive passes, fewer passes into the final third, and fewer passes into the box. City had possession without penetration. The defensive side was worse. At Atleti, Rodri had played in a double pivot with Partey covering for him. But at City, he was now alone as the sole pivot. His instinct was to press aggressively high up the pitch, but he could be easily bypassed because there was no one covering in behind him. In contrast, Fernandinho would have jockeyed backwards, buying time for his teammates to recover, or committing a tactical foul to kill the counter-attack before it started. Rodri pressed and got beaten, and it was the ropey defense that was left to pay for it. When Rodri was beaten, the opposition faced Otamendi in space. And Otamendi in space meant diving into tackles and hoping for the best. City's expected goals against per shot was 0.15, extremely high, meaning they were conceding high-quality chances repeatedly. The left-back situation created another cascade of issues. Benjamin Mendy was fit again and back in the team. Unlike Zinchenko, who would invert into the midfield to help with ball progression, Mendy stayed wide as a traditional fullback. Pep's new love for inverted wingers meant that this was what he wanted, with Mendy flanking Sterling. But with no inverted left-back, and Rodri still learning the ropes, City needed someone to help Rodri with that progression. That someone became Kevin De Bruyne. Instead of operating high in the half space, causing chaos with his positioning and passing, De Bruyne was dropping deep constantly to compensate for the reduced ball progression. City's most creative player was doing the part-time job of being a deep-lying midfielder.
This left Bernardo or David Silva isolated as the sole attacking midfielder. David Silva was still a class act, but a natural decline was beginning to creep in, and now without the twin threat in the half space opposite to him, he was easier to mark tightly because there wasn't another playmaker high up for the defensive midfielder to worry about. The creative engine wasn't running as smoothly as it once did, or at least temporarily. Gundogan's role would grow as the season pushed on. When David Silva was injured or if he needed a break, Gundogan would come in, and he had bags of experience playing deeper, so it would be up to him to drop in alongside Rodri, not just for the progressive benefits, but for the better rest defense through a double pivot. And this was effective in stabilizing the defense, and also giving Kevin De Bruyne complete freedom as the most advanced midfielder to not just play down the right, but also create from everywhere across the pitch. His already historic numbers soared to a new level, more key passes than ever, more passes in general, and his highest ever number of goal contributions in just 32 starts. But there were still issues. The midfield three was still easier to pick up without the inverter, and teams increasingly focused their attention on the Belgian. Aguero's injuries had returned, with Jesus' blunt finishing instincts becoming a recurring issue. The answer, Pep figured late in the season, lay in taking more risks in the attack, with academy graduate Foden key to this. The Englishman became a Swiss Army knife, bending to Pep's attacking needs. Sometimes it was as a left winger, doing his best Sane impression and providing that left-footed width, while Zinchenko inverted. Other times it was as a free eight, like David Silva, but with even more emphasis on goals and assists, more akin to De Bruyne, which gave them 2 free eights once again. And very occasionally he would start on the right and cut inside, although Pep preferred Mahrez here, as he and De Bruyne had forged a great relationship, with both happy to play in the half space or move out wide. Complete disaster was avoided, but it was far from a classic campaign. Liverpool ran away with the title, dropping only 2 points before the restart as a relentless machine that City couldn't simply match in their compromised state. City had failed to challenge for the title, as the interconnected system that had made them so dominant became a web of compromises that made them ordinary. Lyon in the Champions League quarterfinals should have been routine, but it wasn't. City dominated possession and created chances, but lacked cutting edge, and Dembele scored twice on the counter, exploiting the exact defensive fragility that had plagued City all season, in a 3-1 defeat that sent them home. The Holy Grail remained elusive, and now the entire project needed reassessment. Pep would have the summer to rebuild, to address the defensive frailties, the midfield balance, the width problem, to find solutions that didn't compromise other areas. Because this season had proven something important. Perfection in football is temporary, and maintaining it requires constant evolution, constant reinforcement, and vigilance against the chaos that one missing cog can unleash. One summer removed from tactical crisis, Pep Guardiola faced a different kind of problem. The defensive structure had been fixed. Ruben Diaz arrived and immediately transformed the backline, alongside a resurgent Stones. Laporte was fit again, and the centre-back chaos that had defined 1920 was over. If anything, he now had too many first 11 level centre-backs, with Nathan Ake now also a blue. The problem was now at the opposite side of the pitch. City couldn't score. 8 games into the season, and City had mustered just 10 goals, their lowest tally at that stage in 14 years, and they had conceded 11 to boot, giving them a negative goal difference a quarter way through the season. They sat in the bottom half of the table, looking pedestrian, possession without penetration again, and structure without spark. Sergio Aguero was injured again. Jesus continued to underwhelm, and Pep was forced into immediate changes to try and give City a chance. He tried a 4-2-3-1, with Kevin De Bruyne as the false 9. When that didn't work, Pep cycled through endless players as the false 9. One week it was Ferran, then Sterling, then Foden, then Mahrez, and on it went. But it wasn't quite the solution they were looking for. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. City had solved the defensive fragility, only to lose their attacking identity, with even Guardiola openly admitting the issue. What followed was perhaps his most important mid-season tactical revolution at City, a complete reimagining of how the team functioned that would turn a struggling side into champions once again. The early season setup contained fatal flaws that had a lot of overlap with the season prior. Mendy again took up many of the early minutes, providing width for the still inverted Sterling. The legendary David Silva had departed, meaning Gundogan was the firm 8 alongside the fit again De Bruyne. And with Sterling inverting like the prior season, Gundogan often found himself moving deeper alongside Rodri. This pseudo 4-2-3-1 meant that De Bruyne had genuine freedom higher up the pitch, but it was only 110. making City more predictable and easier to mark. Teams would simply focus on De Bruyne, crowd out the middle, and City's attack would stall. The goals dried up and the frustration mounted. Something had to change. In late November, Pep went back to the drawing board and made two crucial decisions that would define the rest of the season. First, he reverted to the 4-3-3 that has served City so well in previous campaigns. More importantly, he made a personnel shift that unlocked everything. Zinchenko and João Cancelo became the first-choice fullbacks, and this opened up the possibilities. Both Zinchenko and Cancelo were extremely comfortable on the ball, far more capable of progression than Walker and Mendy. Against pressing teams, the structure became fluid, and surprisingly, Zinchenko would often stay deeper, with Stones moving extremely wide, while Cancelo shifted into the midfield region alongside Rodri. The safer, more measured passing of Zinchenko in the first phase, the expansive risk-taking passing of Cancelo one layer higher. But when under pressure, both could invert simultaneously, creating a 2-3 shape in the first phase, with Zinchenko and Cancelo flanking Rodri as a midfield three. The technical superiority of these two unlocked the entire structure above them. Suddenly, both free eights were liberated. The midfield that had been stuck deep and predictable was now free to attack. But the fullback change had another consequence that proved equally important. With Zinchenko moving central, the left winger had more room to start out wide. This meant Sterling could now operate from his natural right-hand side, while Phil Foden, a natural left footer, provided genuine width on that left side. But even if Pep did go with inverted wingers, he now had them hold the width a lot more than the prior season. On the right, Cancelo's runs and dribbles up into the right half space meant that there was less need for Mahrez to tuck in early. He could instead hug the touchline initially. Pep's own words captured the shift perfectly. This was the opposite of the inverted winger approach that had defined the previous couple of seasons. Now City were once again stretching teams horizontally, pinning the fullbacks deep and creating space in the half spaces for on-rushing midfielders, rather than having wingers crowd those same spaces. The real beneficiary of these changes was İlkay Gündoğan, and his transformation would win City the title. With Zinchenko initially in midfield or even deeper, rather than pushing high and wide like Mendy, Gündoğan found himself higher in the half space. And this was vital, because De Bruyne's niggling injuries made a reappearance, and the Bernardo-Gündoğan pairing could become too fixated on keeping the ball rather than sniffing out goal. But there was a shift in Gündoğan. It's almost as if the German looked around and said, "No one else wants to give us the goals we need? Fine, I'll do it myself." There was now a menace in his game. He started making runs into the box, arriving late to finish after City had committed bodies forward. The false nine system with Jesus or Ferran operating deeper created even more space for these late arrivals. Gündoğan's timing became City's secret weapon. Defenders focused on the wingers and the false nine, while the midfielder ghosted into the box unmarked. The numbers told the story. 11 of his 13 league goals came after January, once the tactical shift had fully bedded in. Games that City would have drawn 0-0 or 1-1 in the early season were now being won 1-0 or 2-1, with Gündoğan providing the crucial goals with his late runs. He finished as City's top scorer with 13, showing City's attacking struggles. But for a central midfielder in a title-winning side that had always relied on forwards for goals, this was incredible. A key part of this whole puzzle was Cancelo. Bernardo fully accepted that he had a lot of qualities, but goal threat was not one of them. What he had was incredible intelligence and press resistance through his dribbling ability, so he would drift deeper and deeper as more teams were sitting on Rodri, and it became common to see Bernardo receive the ball directly from a goalkeeper here or even in the right-back slots to begin the play. All of this was allowed by João Cancelo. If it had been Walker here, having a free eight drop deeper than him would have meant possession and progression would have stopped as soon as the ball got to Walker. But with Cancelo, not only could he distribute possession here, he could actually seek to push even higher to become the free man in the half space himself, to create and unleash shots like no fullbacks had done before. And it opened up a new dynamic on the right. Mahrez could start wide but could also invert without much thought. That's because these three were now a rotating triangle, with each happy to move into the other's position to keep Pep's preferred structure while being just as dangerous in all three. But Pep's biggest tactical change came as the season ticked on. City were struggling to return to their scintillating best up front, so Pep again changed the attacking structure. With so many non-forwards occupying the false nine role, at times it became too easy for opponents to pick up one man. The answer, Pep figured, was to increase the indecision in the defensive team. And so the double false nine was born. The midfield often featured at least one of Gundogan or Bernardo Silva, both of whom were comfortable dropping deep and operating as a second pivot alongside Rodri. The solid double pivot would be the signal for the third midfielder, De Bruyne when he played or Gundogan otherwise, to push right up alongside the second false nine, who could be Jesus, Ferran, Sterling, Foden, or essentially anyone, but it effectively meant that City had a front two. And that front two would be in constant motion, rotating consistently, dropping deep one at a time, both at a time, or both pushing up and creating room for others. The fluidity and unpredictability made them impossible to defend. It also meant that defenders never knew who to pick up, because there was never a main goal threat, just a cohesive attacking unit, with each piece chipping in here and there. Defensively, the transformation was just as stark, but for different reasons. City again eased off the pressing that had previously been non-negotiable under Guardiola. They still did press at times, but this was more selective rather than constant. The new approach was more cautious, focused on controlling space rather than hunting the ball relentlessly. The reasoning was simple. The aggressive pressing of the previous seasons, when bypassed, left City exposed on the counter. With Walker injured or often on the bench, coupled with Cancelo being higher up, it wasn't just the recovery pace that they lacked. They had one less body in general to help the defense. And they did pay for this at times, with the opposition ripping through this weaker shape. So Pep changed tact. Yes, press when possible, but the priority was now to keep the shape compact, force teams wide, and use the touchline as an extra defender. And the stats showed this. City's passes per defensive action rose to around 10. They were now allowing opponents more passes before they made a defensive action, and now they were only the 6th most intense pressers in the league. But crucially, the quality of the chances they were conceding dropped dramatically. XG against fell from around 37 in the season prior to just 33 in this season, as they had the tightest defense in the league. The Champions League, however, offered one final reminder of Guardiola's tactical adventurism and its risks. City navigated the knockout round smoothly. They went past Dortmund in the quarters, past PSG in the semis, and both times they used the 4-3-3 that had served them so well domestically. Rodri anchoring, Gundogan and Bernardo or De Bruyne ahead of them. The structure was solid. Then came the final against Chelsea, and Pep made a decision that baffled everyone. No Rodri, no Fernandinho. Instead, a front-heavy lineup with Gundogan in a deeper role that he hadn't played in months, and both De Bruyne and Bernardo ahead of him. The midfield was exposed immediately, and Chelsea ran through the middle with ease, and City lost 1-0. It was the one glaring failure of the season, a solution to a problem that did not exist, a gamble that ignored everything that had made them successful that season. But one failure doesn't take away from what had been achieved. From the tactical crisis of 1920 and the early season struggles of 2021 to the complete reconstruction that delivered a third title in 4 years, Pep had proven once again his ability to identify problems, implement solutions, and evolve his approach. City were champions once again, but the Champions League was still the missing piece. Next season, surely Pep would have learned from the final defeat and would come back stronger. The pursuit of Harry Kane had consumed City's summer. Spurs wanted 150 million, City offered 100 million. Spurs refused to budge, and eventually the window closed, with Sergio Aguero gone and no replacement signed. Pep would have to go through the entire season, with only one centre forward, and he was particularly low on confidence. And it wasn't a tactical choice, it was forced on him, and what followed was perhaps his most tactically complex season at City, not by design, but by circumstance. Grealish had arrived for 100 million as the consolation prize, a left winger when what they needed was a centre forward. The false nine that had worked so well in patches of 2020-2021 would now have to become permanent, with a rotating cast being Phil Foden, Jesus, Sterling, Bernardo, and occasionally De Bruyne when fit. And the build-up structure evolved from the previous season. Kyle Walker, an ever-present through Pep's tenure, had seen a significant period on the bench for the first time in the season prior, as Cancelo had risen to prominence. But Pep tweaked his first-choice defense, as the constant counterattacks showed that Kyle Walker in the starting 11 was an absolute must. But at the same time, after a season that had put him in the PFA Team of the Year, Cancelo also had to be one of the first names on the team sheet. He brought not just ball-playing ability from deep, but an incisiveness high up that even midfielders were jealous of. Zinchenko would be the man to pay this time, as Cancelo's versatility allowed him to play both right back and left back, and both of these men were capable of inverting, but there was nuance to their roles over the last season or two. Zinchenko would either invert into the first phase like we saw the season prior, or immediately into the midfield alongside Rodri as early in the piece as possible. Cancelo in this season saw the role slightly differently. Walker on the far side was the defensive inverter in the first phase, and a trend emerging in Pep was his consistent rotation of his favourite defensive pairing season by season. And yes, sometimes this was forced by injury, but sometimes he just liked to switch things up. And this season, it was the turn of Ruben Diaz and Laporte to be the centre-back pairing, and Walker's inversion meant that Laporte was pushed wider. The centre-back was of course left-footed and was comfortable having the responsibility to build up, so there was no need for a left-back to invert. So Cancelo would sometimes push up alongside the flanks, allowing Grealish to move into midfield. At the same time, Cancelo could invert, and once again adaptability was key in Pep's player selection, as Bernardo tended to be the left-sided 8, meaning these three were in constant rotation, making them harder and harder to track. And here's the interesting thing. Conventional wisdom dictated that Jesus, as the centre forward, would have been the man to take advantage of the defensive disorganization this would have caused. For so long, Jesus had been waiting in the wings, ready to take the place of Aguero once he'd departed. But the prior season, Aguero had barely set foot on the pitch, and it had been put on Jesus to take his place. But the Brazilian was disappointing, only scoring 9 in over 2,000 minutes, whilst Aguero in that season netted 4 in just under 600 minutes. And Jesus was aware of this fact, and by the time this season rolled down, his shoulders were slumped and he lacked confidence in front of goal. The issue got so bad in this season, he actually spent a lot of his time operating as a right winger, using his other traits without the pressure of having to be the chief goal threat. So City often found themselves having a recognised centre forward, but still often using a false 9, with Foden being the main man in that position. But Jesus' defensive work rate was one of the big advantages he did bring, always tracking back as City shifted into a 4-4-2 in defence. But still, on the attacking end of things, Pep needed to get one of his most reliable goal scorers in Sterling, or the trickery of Mahrez into the first 11. And with the record signing owning the left wing, Jesus soon found himself back at centre forward. Confidence be damned. But here's the thing, teams have been studying the City team for a while, and they were becoming more and more efficient at defending these central areas. And though they still hadn't fully figured City out, the citizens were having to work for every goal. Many sides were now defending in back fives to even things up against City's own 5. The risk-taking had to increase from the Blues. The left-sided 8, particularly when it was Gundogan in the role, surged forward, and instead of always inverting, at times, City were willing to commit extra men to the attack, with Cancelo not always staying put, and being willing to push so high up that at times the City shape was a 3-1-6, so that they still had an overload even against a back 5. When it worked, which it did more often than not, it was mesmerizing. 6 players operating with both fluidity and structure. The downside was, of course, obvious. The transition vulnerability remained, with players committed forward and only Rodri protecting the defence. If the press was bypassed, the opposition faced space, and City suffered on the counter-attack. It was a season where, tactically, City may not have been at their best, but big performances from big players ensured that they still dominated domestically. But individuals aren't enough when it comes to Europe's biggest stage, so once again they found themselves dumped out of the Champions League. There was a different air about the club ahead of the 22-23 season. City were no strangers to winning the Premier League, having secured 3 of the last 4, with only Klopp's legendary Liverpool side interrupting the procession. Now, City had the opportunity to become only the second club to win a hat-trick. But City also had much bigger ambitions. Pep Guardiola had been brought in to build a dynasty in England, sure, but Mancini and Pellegrini before him had won the league title. There was always the undercurrent that Pep had been brought in for more, to help City take the next step. With multiple leagues under their belt, this might be the season that they took the next step. But Pep knew the squad needed overhauling. In the end, they had snatched the league the prior season, but it wasn't the same flowing football of the Centurions or the 18-19 season, and there was certainly room for improvement. The transfer window showed the citizens weren't messing around. Key cogs without whom many of the league titles would not have been possible were allowed to leave. Alexander Zinchenko, gone. Gabriel Jesus, gone. Fernandinho, gone. Raheem Sterling, gone. But the Blues were also quick to bring in reinforcements. In came Calvin Phillips from Leeds, Sergio Gomez from Anderlecht, and Akanji from Dortmund. But up front is where City's true ambitions were revealed. 2 prodigies who had been making waves in South America and Europe respectively stepped through the doors, Julian Alvarez and Erling Braut Haaland.
Suddenly, City went from 3 seasons of juggling false nines who didn't really want to be there to having 2 out-and-out nines who threatened to be world-class and beyond. But Haaland was undoubtedly the main man. A proper number 9 with pace, power, and finishing that bordered on absurd. The false 9 experiment was over. The collective approach to goal scoring could be shelved. City had their focal point. Except nothing with Guardiola is ever that simple. Haaland's arrival solved the striker problem, but it also created an entirely new set of tactical challenges that would force Pep into perhaps his most radical innovation yet. Because Haaland could finish anything, he also did less of everything else. Aguero, earlier in his career, had been happy dropping deep, and after becoming more of a traditional 9 under Pellegrini, Pep's appointment saw him rekindle his link-up desire. Jesus, on the other hand, always loved dropping in, and so did the false 9s. But that was not Haaland's game. He was a pure penalty box predator, conserving energy for explosive runs and finishing, not dropping into the midfield to collect possession or pressing across the front line. 7 years of the system adapting to one type of forward, only for the exact opposite type to now be leading the line. This created immediate problems. City's system had always relied on everyone contributing defensively, pressing in coordinated units, and maintaining positional discipline across all phases. A striker who stayed high, who didn't drop in, who focused his energy on the final third, this was alien to everything Guardiola had built in Manchester. Early in the season, the issues manifested clearly. The City midfield, particularly over the last seasons with the false 9s, and even the double false 9s, had thrived because of one word: overloads. In conjunction with 1 or 2 inverted fullbacks, they had always had a minimum of 4 players in the midfield, with the forward able to drop in. But when Haaland stayed high and De Bruyne often pushed high up to support him, it meant fewer bodies in the middle third to win second ball, cover transitions, or to provide outlets for the centre-backs. Haaland tried to adapt, and he would positionally drop in, but his touch wasn't always perfect, and his link-up play looked awkward at times. But let's be clear, overall, Haaland was an instant hit, and by matchday 10, he already had 15 league goals. He brought so much that City had been missing. With Sterling gone and the days of the speed demons out wide being a memory, as Grealish and Mahrez were more ball-to-feet wingers, had they still had a false 9, the danger would have been too many players wanted to come towards the ball. But Haaland bucked that trend. He had raw pace and willingness, tirelessly making runs in behind. And the other benefit? Well, De Bruyne now wasn't having to worry about being a part-time false 9 or constantly running in behind. He could drop deeper and focus on creating when needed, with a willing runner ahead of him. His assist numbers shot up to the levels last achieved when Aguero was up top. Those numbers were helped because after years of playing with forwards who tended to perform at XG or slightly lower, Haaland was an overperformer, finishing from situations that often, frankly, seemed impossible. Haaland was also an easy target in the best way possible. With the smaller forwards and the false 9s, often the only way to get them into finishing situations was by crafting the perfect intricate move that often led to cutbacks and finishing opportunities that were impossible to miss. But Haaland was a genuine aerial target, and suddenly De Bruyne and the wide men had an option who they knew they could pick out at the back post. It was a transition phase to a new type of forward, but City were doing a solid job, and come November they were only behind Arsenal, who were moving at such a ferocious pace that if they continued, they would break the Centurions' record. But then, things took a turn for the worse. João Cancelo, one of the finest and most unique fullbacks in world football, would have a brutal falling out with Guardiola. He went from starting 15 of the first 19 league games to being shipped out to Bayern Munich almost overnight. And the cascading problems from this would almost derail the season. Cancelo had been absolutely crucial, inverting into the midfield and beyond to give them that solidity. But with Zinchenko sold to Arsenal, Pep did not have anyone to take on the inverting qualities. It was Nathan Ake who came in, giving City a Walker-Ake fullback pairing. Both competent on the ball, but neither capable of playing that inverted role. This was made worse by the fact that Walker himself was enduring a difficult season, occasionally being usurped by Akanji and right back. With 2 wide fullbacks, teams were no longer outnumbered in the midfield and could do everything in their power to close down Rodri. The mantra was simple: stop Rodri, stop Manchester City. So Pep began to experiment. He would look first to the academy, as Rico Lewis stepped up. The Englishman was diminutive and didn't look like a typical defender, but Pep was confident in his decision, dropping the vastly more experienced Walker for his new prodigy. And here's the thing, Pep did not use him as a traditional fullback. Lewis had come through the CFA and was highly technical, so he would be the man to invert, while now it was the left back who tucked in. The solution worked well, with Lewis being just as secure in possession as the best of them. But there were still problems. Kyle Walker was still one of the quickest and most physical fullbacks around, and while Lewis wasn't slow per se, he paled in comparison, meaning where the right-hand side usually looked impenetrable defensively, teams were beginning to have some success down this side of the pitch on the counter-attack. The business end of the season was fast approaching, with higher and higher caliber opponents coming City's way, and they needed all the defensive steel that they could muster. Kyle Walker had to come back in, meaning City now faced the inversion problem once again. Pep, ever the experimenter, would go for the unconventional option. John Stones had always been a ball-playing centre-back, technically secure enough to operate in midfield if needed. But what Pep devised went far beyond the occasional forays forward. Stones, nominally listed as a centre-back, would push into central midfield alongside Rodri in possession, forming a permanent double pivot that fundamentally altered City's defensive structure. This wasn't Cancelo tucking in from fullback occasionally. This was a centre-back abandoning the defensive line entirely to become a second holding midfielder, leaving a back three of Ruben Dias centrally, with Walker and Ake splitting wide almost as fullbacks. The 4-3-3 on paper became a 3-2-4-1 in possession. The transformation it enabled was profound. With Stones alongside him, Rodri was no longer isolated when City's attacking midfielders pushed forward, and the impact was immediate. Rodri was having a historic season, meaning even with non-traditional midfielders alongside him, his calm head and technicality allowed him to take pressure off of Stones. And because teams would choose to close down Rodri first, it allowed Stones to operate under much less pressure. Not only that, if teams were too passive and went man-to-man against free eight, Stones wasn't shy in pushing up himself to be the extra man. The build-up structure this created solved multiple problems at the same time. City now always had numerical superiority in the first phase. Against teams playing with two forwards, City had 5 players to progress through. If opponents committed extra bodies forward to bypass the press, well, gaps opened up elsewhere. If they stayed compact, City could circulate patiently, waiting for the moment to strike. And now, with 2 holding players providing security, Guardiola could push an attacking midfielder extraordinarily high. De Bruyne, nominally listed as a number 8 or a 10, was often stationed as close to Haaland as possible. All of a sudden, he no longer had to drop deep to orchestrate in possession, and instead he could wait high up for the ball to be progressed to him. And now his job was to look for combinations in the final third, and at times making runs beyond Haaland into the box, arriving late to finish off attacks. And all of this was held together by the whip. With the departure of Sterling and Jesus, City's attacking dynamics had changed. Sterling's direct running, his ability to stretch defensive vertically with runs in behind, and Jesus' work rate and willingness to sprint the channels repeatedly were gone. In their place, Grealish continued down the left, and Mahrez usually occupied the right. Both were excellent technical players, capable of beating defenders 1v1, and happy to receive the ball under pressure, but neither had the raw acceleration that Sterling had. So City's wide play became more about retention and progression rather than penetration, more about combination and control than explosive directness. This made Haaland's presence even more critical. Without wingers who could consistently threaten in behind, having a striker who provided that vertical depth became essential. Haaland's runs forced defensive lines deeper, creating the space in front of them that Grealish, Mahrez and the midfielders needed to operate. Where Sterling might have stretched teams with his pace from wide positions, now it was Haaland doing it centrally, and the wingers exploiting the gaps. Pep's solution was to double down on what his team did best: patient positional play. If City could not stretch teams vertically with pace from wide areas, they'd stretch them horizontally with width, then exploit the gaps it created. Grealish and Mahrez would genuinely start wide, forcing opposition fullbacks to track them. This created more room in the half spaces for Gundogan, Bernardo, De Bruyne, or even Stones with the late runs at times, to receive between the lines. The crossing numbers increased, and this was partly by design, with Haaland's aerial threat making crosses a genuine dangerous weapon, rather than a last resort. And on the other hand, City's pressing, that manic intensity that defined Pep's early years in England, continued its evolution into something more measured and selective. After initial experimentation, it was clear Haaland would not be a consistent presser. City would move either into a compact and considered 4-4-2, or Haaland would actually drop deep, his role being to cover the pivot whilst the midfielders ahead of him and the wingers pressed. Pep was once again adapting to the pieces at his disposal. The effectiveness varied. When City won the ball high, they were devastating. The counterpress would swarm immediately, and they would win possession in dangerous areas, with Haaland suddenly explosive in transition. But when the press was bypassed, well, City's structure could look stretched, the distance between the units becoming too big to cover quickly. But the Champions League had always been the obsession, the trophy that had eluded Pep since 2011. With City, he had exited at the semi-finals before, but this time, the system held. They reached the final, Inter Milan in Istanbul, who were looking to defend deep for much of the game. But eventually, the City pressure told, with a Rodri goal from the edge of the box. 7 years of European heartbreak ended not with the free-flowing football that defined Pep's Barcelona, but with something more pragmatic, more resilient. The Holy Grail finally claimed. The treble had arrived not despite Haaland's limitations, but by building a system that maximized his devastating strengths, while compensating for everything that he could not provide. The season that had begun with uncertainty about whether he could manage Pep's football ended with 52 goals and 3 trophies. Proof that even at the summit of the sport, Pep's willingness to tear up his own blueprints remained, and that was what separated him from everyone else. There was a different air around the club ahead of the 2023-24 season. City had just completed the treble, the Holy Grail finally claimed, Pep's European curse broken. 3 consecutive league titles already secured. But now there was a chance to do something no English club had ever achieved: win 4 straight top-flight titles. United had won 3 in a row twice, but never 4. This was uncharted territory. By the end of 22-23, City had achieved tactical perfection, and it meant that Guardiola was faced with the question he'd been asked so many times before. Will you try to evolve from perfection, or try to preserve it? Well, football doesn't allow preservation. The moment one club figures out the most effective strategy, hundreds of others get to work figuring out how to defeat it. How would City react? Well, the Blues had been busy in the transfer market, but the heart of every Guardiola team was the midfield. But after years of service, Gundogan would complete a move to Barcelona, taking his goal threat from midfield with him. And 23 minutes into the new league season, Kevin De Bruyne, body now aging and constantly battling against scar tissue, would go down. A hamstring injury, severe enough to mean that he missed 19 league games in a row. They had plenty of other midfielders who could retain the ball, but with these two gone, there was no drive or creativity from the midfield. And to add insult to injury, another team in blue had acquired exactly what Pep needed from City, and every week, Cole Palmer made the decision to sell look more and more ridiculous. But another fixture from the treble season was missing, as Stones would miss the first 7 games with a hip injury, and spent the season nursing it, meaning he only completed 9 full matches in the Premier League. Despite all of this, Pep would look to initially stick to the winning formula. Manuel Akanji would replicate Stones' role. On paper it seemed logical. He was comfortable on the ball, positionally intelligent, and technically sound enough to operate in midfield at times. But the mechanism that made Stones special wasn't just stepping into the midfield. It's what he did once he was there. Stones could receive on the half turn, play penetrative passes forward, carry the ball with genuine midfield instincts, and Akanji on the other hand, when pressed with his back to goal, defaulted to the safe pass back to the centre-backs. The difference between progression and circulation, between penetration and possession. Rodri attempted to compensate, taking on as much of the ball-playing responsibility as he could. He'd receive the first pass under pressure, bounce it to Akanji, who could now receive facing forward, then look for the next phase. But this added an extra pass to every sequence, an extra second for defenses to organize, an extra moment where City's rhythm stalled. Add to that the fact that one of the free aides higher up was now either Kovacic or Bernardo, who are the definitions of retention-based rather than penetration-based midfielders, and the problems became clear. The fluidity that had defined the treble run, that ability to accelerate through phases of play, to move from defense to attack quickly, had vanished. City were still dominant, but suddenly they looked labored and struggled to make teams pay when they had possession, and opponents were learning why. Their opposition had spent the summer studying the treble winners. The solution they'd found was devastatingly simple: protect the center at all costs. Teams began defending in super narrow 4-4-2 formations, wingers operating barely wider than the penalty area. The width of defensive blocks had shrunk to suffocating levels. The tactical intelligence wasn't just in the narrowness, but in the discipline. Opponents opponent front twos refused to be baited into pressing, no matter how much Diaz and Akanji were inviting the pressure. They'd learned that pressing City's centre-backs meant leaving space for Rodri, and Rodri finding space meant City finding rhythm. It was better to stay compact, stay narrow, and force City to play around rather than through. So, they formed defensive midfield boxes, 4 players in a square, barely 15 yards across. City's midfield superiority, which had caused issues for years through a double pivot and 2 free 8s, was neutralized by this new defensive setup. Their only hope was either the centre-backs being so patient that eventually attackers had to commit, although this was becoming rarer and rarer, or Rodri's movement finding even the smallest bit of space to progress the ball with his first touch before the pressure inevitably arrived. The 3 matches that Rodri missed through suspension exposed the terrifying extent of City's reliance on the Spanish midfielder. Pep tried everything: Kovacic and Bernardo as a double pivot, Lewis inverting from right back. But even with these excellent ball retainers like Kovacic filling in, they couldn't replicate Rodri's unique combination of press resistance, progressive passing, and defensive coverage. And the issues weren't just in the midfield. Their chief marksman, Haaland, was suddenly finishing below XG and had several matches where he could only muster 1 shot. But the problem was beyond just his finishing. City failed to create 1.5 XG or more on 10 occasions before the turn of the year. They were failing to create chances for him altogether. And even before the Rodri suspension, Pep knew that the problems were deep-rooted and needed fixing. He flirted with reintroducing the prior season's saviour Enrico Lewis to the right-back slot to give him a more technical option alongside Rodri as compared to Akanji. Good in theory, but something else was at play. With teams protecting the centre so much, Pep had taken to having his centre-backs build up wide. Extremely wide. So wide that they could have 2 versus 1s against the fullbacks in these regions, or draw an extra defender out from the centre to make more room for the midfielders. But the risk was obvious. It led to massive gaps between the centre-backs. If City lost the ball, opponents would be marauding right through the middle of the pitch. And if it was Lewis inverting, they wouldn't even have the recovery pace of Walker available. So Walker effectively had to start, forcing the Akanji solution. The gaps, however, were still massive between the defenders, so Pep once again began to experiment, this time with Ederson. More and more, the Brazilian was encouraged to push high up, so that effectively he formed a back 4. The goal was simple. If a centre-back being in possession wasn't tempting enough to draw a presser, maybe Ederson having the ball would be, again, creating the potential for a midfielder to then be found. Or, worst case, if no one was drawn, the chain structure gave the left-back Guardiola the permission to push higher up, creating those true 2 versus 1s out wide. And it did have success, but even a keeper as adventurous as Ederson would have limitations on how high he would push up, so it was impossible to fully rely on the widest defenders to provide the width, because the central centre-back would be completely isolated. So the responsibility fell on the wide men. Doku was tailor-made for this. He'd arrived for £55 million as the solution to City's wide sterility. Where Grealish had increasingly become a ball retainer with diminished ability to take on his man 1v1, Doku was chaos incarnate, a risk-taker who would use elite dribbling to attack defenders relentlessly. His impact was immediate, forcing teams to double-team him, creating room for teammates elsewhere, or hitting the byline himself for a cutback. But the Belgians' game had a fatal flaw. Grealish retained possession, Doku tended to lose it. With City's centre-back positioned so wide, every lost dribble became a potential catastrophe. The back 3 wasn't quick enough to fill the gaps both vertically and laterally, meaning opposition sides could counter almost at will. Doku was only a partial solution. Pep needed to solve the creativity void Gundogan and De Bruyne had left, and he believed he had found an unlikely answer in Julian Alvarez, who on paper was a striker, but most often was deployed in the hole behind Haaland, effectively a second striker drifting into the midfield to provide the missing goal threat from the deeper positions. In theory, it was a workable solution. Alvarez possessed the work rate to press relentlessly, the technical quality to combine in tight spaces, and crucially, the instinct to arrive in dangerous areas and finish chances. Where Kovacic and Bernardo would circulate possession, Alvarez would penetrate. Without De Bruyne or Gundogan, Alvarez might just be able to be the dual creative and goal-scoring threat. This effectively created a lopsided 4-2-3-1 to begin with, that would still transform into Pep's preferred shape. But now, City effectively had a striker playing as a free 8, bringing bodies into the box and occupying defenders in ways that opened up space for others. He did an admirable job when it worked, with the Argentine contributing heavily in terms of goals and assists. But Alvarez, for all his qualities, was not De Bruyne. He lacked the Belgians' passing range, that ability to split defenses with a single ball. His decision-making, whilst improving, wasn't yet at the level required to consistently unlock compact blocks that City faced. He did a good job filling a role that wasn't natural to him, but City's patterns still felt disjointed, the attacks laboured. So the season's true rescue came not from tactical innovation, but from a player finally stepping out of the shadows. Phil Foden had spent years as the heir apparent, the wonder kid perpetually waiting for his moment, shuttling between the wings and occasionally central cameos, while more established names occupied the prime real estate. But with Gundogan gone and De Bruyne absent, the throne sat empty. And Foden, after years of understudy, claimed it. Guardiola adjusted everything around this realization. The fullbacks became more traditional, Walker and Guardiola pushing on to provide genuine width, rather than tucking inside, with the centre-back now dropping back into the back line. This freed Foden to drift centrally, but more importantly, it created a tactical balance that finally unlocked City's attack. Because alongside Foden, Doku was providing something that City hadn't possessed all season. Genuine wide threat that forced defensive blocks to make impossible decisions. Where Grealish had become predictable, retaining possession but rarely threatening, Doku was pure chaos. He'd receive the ball and immediately attack, forcing fullbacks into panicked backpedaling and dragging central defenders wide to provide cover. The two created entirely different types of danger that opposition managers couldn't solve at the same time. Doku threatened with explosive pace and direct dribbling, the kind that beats defenders through sheer acceleration and forces last-ditch challenges. Foden, on the other hand, had guile and technique. He'd glide past players and use subtle shifts of direction and close control to navigate through spaces that did not seem to exist. As Doku attacked, defensive blocks had to stretch horizontally to cover his runs. Fullbacks couldn't fully stay narrow anymore. One had to slide across to support the overwhelmed fullback. This horizontal stretching created exactly what Foden needed: central space to operate. He'd drift inside from the right, receiving between the lines with defenders torn between tracking his movement or keeping an eye on Walker down the right. And suddenly, he was receiving, turning and facing forward, threatening either to drive into the box or thread passes through gaps. The stats told part of the story. By the end of the season, Foden finished with 19 league goals, more than any other City midfielder had managed under Pep. But the numbers couldn't capture what he truly brought: a true thrust to City's attacking patterns, a sense that they could break down defenses through quick combination as well as long-range shots. After years of being the talented youngster who'd eventually take over, Foden had seized his moment completely. He was named the player of the season, and it felt like he had rescued City's season, not through occasional brilliance or cameos from the bench, but through sustained week after week excellence that transformed him from promising talent into a genuine world-class midfielder. De Bruyne's eventual return would add another dimension, but Foden had proven something crucial. He could now fully share the burden with De Bruyne. Foden was now the well-established prince, but there was still only one king in Manchester. When Kevin De Bruyne finally returned in January, the fear was that his reintegration might disrupt what Foden had been building. Two elite creators occupying similar spaces could create congestion rather than combination. Instead, they had a beautiful synergy. 4 assists and a goal in his first 4 matches were more than a return to form for the Belgian. It was a statement, declaring that even at 32 and returning from yet another serious injury, he was still the measuring stick for every player in the team. His understanding of Haaland's movement had not faded. Everything remained intact, maybe now even sharpened by the need to show that he was far from over the hill. But what made his partnership with Foden work was how naturally they synchronized. There was no territorial dispute, no clash of egos over who occupied which spaces. They simply read each other, one dropping when the other pushed, one moving wide right when the other came central, creating a fluid interchange that proved impossible to defend. City won the league with 91 points. Arsenal finished 2 points behind after leading for much of the campaign. 4 consecutive league titles, something no other English club had managed. But the numbers told the story of survival at the top, rather than dominance. 9 defeats across all competitions, their highest under Pep. Defensive vulnerabilities that shouldn't have existed. An FA Cup final loss to Manchester United that stung precisely because it exposed how far City's systematic superiority had eroded. Regardless, the 4th title was secured. What followed in 24-25 would prove that those warning signs had been more than pessimism, and they were perhaps just an early warning system.
The fourth consecutive title was barely secured before the collapse began. City entered 24-25, having achieved the impossible. But those warning signs from the previous campaign, the defensive vulnerabilities, the Rodri dependency, the struggles to break down compact blocks, hadn't been addressed. They'd been ignored. And tactical problems left unsolved don't disappear, they simply get taken advantage of more ruthlessly game by game. What followed wasn't a gradual decline, it was a system imploding in real time. The transfer window saw Julian Alvarez leave for Atletico Madrid. It was clear that he had world-class potential, but with Haaland set to own Alvarez's first-choice position for the next decade plus, and Atleti offering a record departure fee, City reluctantly accepted. But transfers weren't the only way City would lose a key cog. 27 minutes into the match against Arsenal on the 22nd of September, Rodri went down. ACL ruptured, season over. The best midfielder in the world, the soon-to-be Ballon d'Or winner, the player around whom Pep's entire tactical system had been calibrated, was gone. And City had no replacement. Calvin Phillips had been the only dedicated holding midfielder brought in since Fernandinho's departure, and he'd never been given a genuine opportunity. Now Pep was paying for years of poor squad planning. The options were inadequate, and everybody knew it. Mateo Kovacic could play the position, but fundamentally he was a different type of midfielder. Gundogan, brought back from Barcelona, thrived in a double pivot early in his career, but had been moved progressively forward. Mateus Nunes was a box-to-box player at best. None were built to be the solo defensive pivot that Pep's system demanded. What followed was one win in 13 matches, City's lowest win percentage, 18%, than in any other 13-game stretch of the Pep era. The fortress crumbled, and understanding why requires understanding what happens when a team attacks. For years, Pep's answer had been rest defense. The positioning of players behind the ball whilst the team attacked, preventing transitions before they could begin. That's what allowed that ferocious pressing style. City would attack in a 3-5 or a 2-3-5 structure. 3 defenders and 2 holding midfielders, or 2 defenders and 3 midfielders, forming a secure base whilst the front 5 created chances. It meant 5 players to attack, knowing that they had a strong foundation, a rest defense that could do all the worrying about what happened on the counter-attack. In 24-25, searching for solutions to the compact blocks that had frustrated City, Guardiola deployed a diamond midfield structure, a 3-4-3. 3 midfielders and 3 attackers ahead of the single pivot. Lewis would push high from right back to join the attack, and this 3-1 shape chronically left the deepest pivot exposed. Even before the Rodri injury, the shape had been creaking. With only one midfielder screening the defense, City's counter-pressing became tragically simple to bypass. Previously, 2 or 3 midfielders would be positioned to engage when possession was lost. Now there was often just Kovacic or Gundogan as the solo pivot, isolated, trying to cover ground that used to be occupied by multiple players. The consequences were immediate. When that lone pivot was drawn to the ball carrier, opponents could simply play through any vertical third at will. No second midfielder existed to cover the space, no safety net remained, and teams were running directly at City's backline with alarming frequency. But it wasn't just the solo pivot. Pep's desperation to create new width saw him push his centre-backs quite wide early on. Guardiola in particular was given permission to advance aggressively down the left flank, even when nominally part of a back 3. This created massive gaps between the centre-backs that opponents exploited ruthlessly. Understanding why Rodri was irreplaceable requires understanding what he actually did. Kovacic is an outstanding midfielder, technically excellent, comfortable under pressure, capable of taking opponents on in tight spaces. But those qualities weren't the ones that City needed from a single pivot. Rodri's genius was often in what he didn't do. Pep himself had said one of the key changes that transformed Rodri from good to great was getting him to understand that a defensive midfielder's movement should be minimal, stay in position, be the reference point, let the game flow through you, rather than carrying the ball away from where the team needs you. Kovacic's instinct was the opposite. When pressed with his back to goal, he would take players on, a valuable skill, but not what the position demanded. Dribbling is slower than passing, and with most teams defending deep against City, it gave opponents more time to reorganize. More crucially, it meant that City's most important positional reference was constantly on the move, disrupting the entire structure. But even when Kovacic stayed in position, the differences were stark. His passing range was limited compared to Rodri. He couldn't hit those early switches that stretched defenses horizontally. He couldn't launch the precise long balls that Haaland thrived on. And he couldn't consistently play the passes that broke defensive lines before they'd fully organized. Even City's emergency option disappeared. For years when their intricate play stalled, they'd had Kyle Walker's overlapping runs. Rodri's chipped passes would land perfectly on Walker's foot as he burst forward, allowing him to deliver crosses before defenders could recover. With Kovacic, either the ball didn't get released on time, or the pass lacked the precision required. Another weapon gone from the City arsenal. The progressive passing stats told the story. Rodri's ability to turn recovered possession into attacks quickly, those longer passes that broke lines, the switches that found players with space and pace were absent. City's attacks became laboured, predictable, easier to defend against. Across the league, teams identified City's vulnerabilities and developed systematic approaches to exploit them. The patterns became depressingly familiar. Opponents would defend in compact shapes, often a 4-2-4 or a 4-4-2, with extraordinary organisation. Rather than pressing City's build-up aggressively, they'd allow the ball to progress to certain zones and then spring into coordinated traps. Opposition forwards refused to be baited into pressing City centre-backs, no matter how much space Diaz and Akanji had on the ball. They'd learned that pressing centre-backs meant leaving space for the pivot, and with Rodri gone and Kovacic's limitations exposed, there was only one player they needed to neutralise. It was better to stay compact, force City to play around rather than through, then break when possession was won. It became tougher and tougher for City to break through, and even the likes of Haaland were getting less and less shots on goal. And even when opponents won the ball, City's poor rest defence meant that they could transition through the centre with alarming ease. With the struggles mounting, Guardiola had experimented. Searching for solutions to compact defensive blocks, he'd at times deployed his wingers extraordinarily narrow, almost as second strikers flanking Haaland. The theory was to overwhelm defences centrally through sheer concentration of bodies in the half spaces. But the reality was congestion and predictability. With wingers inside, City's attacks funneled them into the same central corridors repeatedly. Opponents didn't need to defend the entire width of the pitch. They could compact into a narrow block and suffocate everything City attempted. There were no wide outlets for switches, no ability to stretch defences horizontally. By December, Pep had largely abandoned that experiment. Traditional width returned, the wingers resumed hugging the touchlines, but the damage and points dropped had been done. With width restored, Pep began addressing the deeper structural problems. The diamond formation, that 3-1 rest defense, had left City exposed and was no longer deployed as the default. Instead, City became more flexible, sometimes reverting to a double pivot when the defensive security mattered more than the attacking numbers. The change was subtle but significant. Rather than committing 4 attackers ahead of a lone pivot every match, Pep would assess opponents and adjust accordingly. Against teams likely to counterattack aggressively, City would keep 2 midfielders deeper for the defensive numbers that had been missing. Gonzalez's arrival from Porto in January provided the missing piece for a period, a genuine defensive midfielder who could replicate some of what Rodri provided. Not the passing range and not the tactical genius, but the physicality and positional discipline to anchor the midfield when deployed as a single pivot. His signing was an admission that the Rodri problem could not be solved internally. But even then, it wasn't a plug-and-play situation, as he was eased slowly into the league and the team. When he wasn't selected, it often became a midfield 4, but most often a 3, containing the likes of Gundogan, Kovacic and Bernardo. In many ways, it was an admittance that their creative magic would not be coming from the central areas. Instead, the focus would be on retention, risk aversion, and putting the burden on the wide men to provide the creativity. It was pragmatic and far from sexy, but the results improved. Comfortable victories over weaker sides, crucial wins against top-half opposition that showed glimpses of the old control. The width gave City attacking balance again. The more conservative rest defense reduced the counter-attacking opportunities opponents had been exploiting. Gonzalez provided stability when City needed to protect leads. The addition of Omar Mamouche proved to be an astute piece of business. Not only was he a good backup in the event of a Haaland injury, he also brought something genuinely different. We've already touched on the midfield being more retention-focused rather than running in behind, and similar was true for the wide men. Both tricky, but both preferred to first receive the ball to feet before taking on their man. Haaland was the only player capable of providing any depth, making the Blues more predictable. Mamouche was comfortable also running in behind, providing City a secondary option, meaning defenses now had 2 men running in behind to worry about. And it was even more effective when Haaland and the other midfielder were higher in the midfield, where they were able to draw the centre-backs up the pitch, and Mamouche would be quick to attack the blind side to get into the space in behind. And the directive was clear from Pep. The midfielders still played safe, but now when the opportunity presented itself, they were given the permission to be more direct and to attempt the riskier passes in behind when needed. By late winter, City had arrested their slide, though they remained well off title pace. But the fundamental problems hadn't been solved, merely managed. The rest defense remained vulnerable compared to previous seasons. The pressing intensity hadn't returned to peak levels. Individual brilliance from Haaland and others was still masking systematic weaknesses, rather than City's system generating systematic superiority. It was survival, not dominance. Perhaps most troubling was what Guardiola suggested about where football had evolved. Modern football is the way Bournemouth, Newcastle, Brighton and Liverpool play, he said at one point. Direct, physical, intense. City's technical superiority couldn't compete at the physical level required by the new reality. It was a remarkable admission from the coach who'd spent 15 years proving possession's football supremacy. The suggestion that football had moved beyond positional play to something more primitive and direct felt like a capitulation, an acknowledgement that City's approach, once revolutionary, might have reached its natural limitations. The machine that had won 4 consecutive titles through systematic superiority was grinding rather than purring. By season's end, City were nowhere near title winners Liverpool. The exact position mattered less than what it represented, the end of an era of untouchable superiority. The club that had redefined English football through tactical perfection was all of a sudden beginning to crumble. What made 24-25 so striking wasn't just that City declined. All great teams decline eventually. What was striking was how quickly their systematic superiority became systematic vulnerability once the wrong pieces were removed. But will 2025-26 be the season that City recover? Hope you enjoyed the video. If so, you're clearly a tactics nerd, so don't forget to check out Tactical Mastery through the link in the description below.